Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. This incident occurred nearly 6 years ago, though the memories remain as fresh as if they happened yesterday. I've changed names and some minor details for privacy reasons, as I'm using a temporary account that I won't access again after sharing this story. At the time of these events, I'd been dating Ivy for just over 4 years. Both of us shared an intense passion for outdoor activities: hiking, fishing, nature photography, stargazing, and spontaneous picnics. There was something liberating about driving to an unfamiliar park and exploring its hidden trails together. We were both 27 then, working entry-level corporate jobs that kept us indoors far more than we preferred. Our weekend escapes into nature served as our salvation from the fluorescent-lit cubicles and endless email chains. That particular Saturday in late September began like many others. I woke at dawn, the autumn air crisp as it filtered through our apartment window. Ivy was already awake, brewing coffee and scrolling through hiking possibilities on her phone. "What about Ravenwood State Forest?" she suggested, passing me a steaming mug. "It's about 2 hours north. The photos look incredible. There's a river cutting through it and supposedly some interesting rock formations." I sipped my coffee, examining the trail maps over her shoulder. "Looks perfect. Want to make it an overnight trip? I could pack the camping gear just in case." Ivy nodded enthusiastically. "Weather report says clear skies, but I'll bring extra layers. Fall nights get cold up north." I loaded our camping equipment into the trunk of my aging sedan, not because we had definitely decided to camp, but because Ivy and I had developed a habit of letting our adventures unfold organically. Sometimes a day hike transformed into an impromptu camping trip when we couldn't bear to leave the tranquility of the wilderness. Other times, unexpected rain or dropping temperatures would send us scurrying back to the comfort of our apartment. The drive north was pleasant. We listened to podcasts, sang along to nostalgic songs from our college years, and discussed possibilities for our future. By the time we reached the almost empty parking area at Ravenwood, the conversations had drifted to our shared dream of buying land somewhere remote, perhaps building a cabin with our own hands. "Maybe somewhere like this," Ivy said as she laced up her hiking boots. "Far enough from the city to see stars, but close enough that we can still get decent takeout when we're feeling lazy." I laughed, shouldering my backpack with our essentials: water bottles, trail mix, first aid supplies, a small camera, and rain jackets just in case. Ivy carried a smaller pack with additional snacks in her sketchbook. The trailhead welcomed us with a weathered wooden sign marking the beginning of the Oak Ridge Trail, a 12-mile loop through the forest. A smaller, faded notice beside it warned hikers to stay on marked paths due to steep ravines and unstable ground in certain areas. The sign mentioned nothing about dangerous plants or other hazards, a detail that would later haunt me. We signed the trail register, noting our planned route and expected return time, a safety measure we always observed even on well-traveled paths. Only 2 other names were listed for that day, both having started several hours earlier. As we stepped onto the trail, dappled sunlight filtered through the canopy of maple and oak trees, their leaves beginning their annual transition to brilliant orange and crimson hues. The forest welcomed us with gentle sounds, birds calling to one another, leaves rustling in the occasional breeze, and somewhere in the distance, the promise of running water. "This is exactly what I needed," Ivy sighed contentedly, reaching for my hand as we walked. "I've been dreaming about this all week." I squeezed her hand in agreement. The stresses of our daily lives seemed to dissolve with each step deeper into the woods. Neither of us could have anticipated how drastically our peaceful excursion would transform in the hours to come. The first mile of our hike fulfilled every expectation. The trail meandered gently through groves of towering trees, occasionally offering glimpses of the valley below through breaks in the forest. We stopped frequently, Ivy to sketch interesting fungi or unusual rock formations, me to photograph the interplay of light and shadow in the forest. After about an hour, the path began to descend gradually toward what trail signs indicated was Blackwater River. The name seemed appropriate. As we caught our first glimpse of the water, dark and seemingly bottomless despite its clarity, flowing with deceptive calmness between moss-covered banks. "Want to stop for lunch when we reach the river?" I suggested, noting the time approaching noon. Ivy nodded, adjusting her pack. "Definitely. I read there's a small beach area that's perfect for picnics." As we continued downward, the forest began to change subtly around us. The trees grew more densely packed, their trunks wider and covered with thick, gnarled bark. The cheerful songs of warblers and finches from the higher elevations gave way to the occasional harsh cry of a crow. The temperature dropped noticeably, not unusual for a river valley, but the change felt somehow more pronounced than it should have been. I first noticed the discomfort as we approached the final descent to the river. A vague sense of unease settled over me, similar to the feeling of being watched. I found myself glancing repeatedly over my shoulder, only to see nothing but the empty trail behind us. "Everything okay?" Ivy asked, noticing my distraction. "Yeah, just thought I heard something," I replied, trying to dismiss the sensation. "Probably just a squirrel." We reached the river shoreline around 12:30. The promised beach was there, a small crescent of smooth stones and sand nestled in a bend of the Blackwater. We claimed a relatively flat boulder as our dining table and unpacked our simple lunch of sandwiches, fruit, and trail mix. As we ate, I couldn't shake the growing discomfort. The river's flow created sounds that somehow seemed wrong. Not the expected gentle gurgling, but something that resembled distant conversations just below the threshold of comprehension. The waters moved with an almost deliberate quality, swirling in patterns that drew and held my attention. "Do you hear that?" I asked Ivy, setting down my half-eaten sandwich. She tilted her head, listening. "The water? Or those birds?" "No, it's like—" I struggled to articulate the sensation. "Like whispers, coming from the river." Ivy looked concerned. "I don't hear anything like that. Just normal river sounds." I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss my unease. "Maybe I'm just dehydrated or something." I deliberately drank more water, hoping to clear my head. The rational part of my brain insisted I was simply experiencing the effects of too little sleep the night before, perhaps combined with the change in altitude. After lunch, we decided to continue following the river trail, which paralleled the water for another 2 miles before climbing back up to higher elevations. The path narrowed considerably here, forcing us to walk single file in many sections. Dense undergrowth pressed close on either side, ferns and shrubs I couldn't identify creating walls of vegetation that seemed to reach for us as we passed. The sounds of the forest had grown strangely muted, as though something was dampening the normal wilderness acoustics. Even our footsteps seemed oddly absorbed by the ground, leaving an unsettling silence in their wake. The air felt heavier, almost resistant to our movement through it. "Is it just me, or is it getting harder to breathe down here?" I asked, pausing to take deeper breaths. Ivy stopped beside me, looking concerned. "Now that you mention it, the air does feel kind of thick. Maybe there's a weather front moving in?" I checked the sky through gaps in the canopy, but the small patches of visible blue appeared unchanged. No clouds, no darkening that would indicate an approaching storm. "Let's just keep moving," I suggested, fighting the irrational urge to turn back. "I'm sure it'll be better once we start climbing again." We pressed on, but the sense of wrongness continued to intensify. The path twisted unpredictably, sometimes seeming to double back on itself. Though we followed the trail markers diligently, I couldn't shake the sensation that we were walking in circles, or worse, being deliberately led deeper into the forest than we intended to go. By mid-afternoon, fatigue began to set in more severely than it should have for experienced hikers like us. My legs felt unusually heavy and a persistent headache had taken root behind my eyes. Ivy, typically the more energetic of us, had grown quiet. Her earlier enthusiasm noticeably diminished. "Let's take a break," I suggested, spotting a fallen log that offered a reasonable resting place. As we sat, I noticed Ivy staring intently at the ground, her expression unreadable. "What's wrong?" I asked. She didn't respond immediately. When she finally looked up, something subtle had changed in her eyes, a slight unfocusing, as though she was simultaneously looking at me and through me. "Nothing," she said after a pause that lasted too long. "Just thinking." Her voice sounded normal yet somehow hollow, as if something essential had been removed from it. I felt the first real flicker of fear ignite somewhere deep in my chest, though I couldn't yet articulate why. As the afternoon progressed, the forest grew increasingly oppressive. The trees seemed to lean inward above the trail, creating a claustrophobic tunnel effect that hadn't been present earlier in our hike. Shadows stretched longer than they should have for the time of day, distorting familiar shapes into menacing silhouettes. I checked my watch, 3:42 p.m. We had been hiking for nearly 5 hours, and according to the trail map, should have reached the halfway point of the loop by now. Yet nothing in our surroundings corresponded with the landmarks indicated on the map. I think we might have taken a wrong turn somewhere, I admitted to Ivy, unfolding the paper map again. She stood motionless several feet ahead of me, her back turned. She hadn't spoken in nearly 20 minutes, unusual for her, as she typically kept up a steady stream of observations about plants and wildlife during our hikes. "Ivy?" I called more loudly this time. "Can you come look at this map with me?" When she turned, her movements were strangely mechanical, lacking the fluid grace I associated with her. Her eyes met mine, but there was a disturbing emptiness in them, not vacant, but somehow altered, as though something else was looking out through her familiar irises. "We need to go deeper," she said, her voice flat and uninflected. An involuntary shiver ran through me. "What? No, I think we need to find our way back to the main loop. We must have wandered onto a side trail." "Deeper," she repeated, turning away and continuing down the path without waiting for my response. Alarmed, I hurried after her, grabbing her arm to stop her progress. "Ivy, what's going on? You're acting strange." She stared at my hand on her arm as though it was a foreign object, then slowly raised her gaze to my face. For a moment there was confusion in her expression, then recognition flooded back. "Sorry," she said, blinking rapidly. "I think I zoned out for a minute there. What were you saying about the map?" Relief washed over me, though unease lingered. "I was saying I think we've somehow gotten off the main trail. We should have reached Morrison Ridge by now, according to this." I pointed to our intended location on the map. Ivy frowned, studying the paper. "That's weird. I've been following the blue blazes the whole time." She pointed to a faded blue mark on a nearby tree trunk, the official trail indicator for the Oak Ridge Loop. I hesitated, wondering if my own perception was somehow compromised. Had I imagined her strange behavior moments ago? Was I becoming unnecessarily paranoid? "Maybe the map isn't as accurate as it should be," I suggested, trying to rationalize our situation. "Let's keep following the markers, but if we don't reach some recognizable landmark soon, we should consider turning back." Ivy nodded, but something in her expression had changed again. A subtle hardening around her mouth, a tightness that hadn't been there before. "Whatever you think is best," she said, her tone carrying an undercurrent I couldn't quite identify. We continued forward, the path growing increasingly difficult to navigate. Roots seemed to rise from the earth specifically to catch our feet, and low-hanging branches appeared to reach for us as we passed. The air had taken on a peculiar scent, not the expected forest aromas of decomposing leaves and damp earth, but something sharper, almost medicinal. My headache intensified, accompanied now by occasional moments of dizziness. Colors seemed simultaneously more vivid and somehow wrong, as though the natural palette of the forest had been subtly altered. Sounds continued to distort, the distant call of a bird stretching unnaturally, the rustle of leaves taking on rhythmic qualities that mimicked whispered words. Despite the increasing strangeness, I remained determined to maintain a rational perspective. There had to be logical explanations. Perhaps we were experiencing the effects of exhaustion, or maybe some environmental factor was affecting our perceptions. Poisonous plants existed in these forests. Perhaps we had inadvertently brushed against something with psychoactive properties. I was so consumed with these thoughts that I almost collided with Ivy, who had stopped abruptly in the middle of the path. "Do you see them?" she whispered, staring into the dense undergrowth to our right. I followed her gaze but saw nothing unusual, just shadows among ferns and the gnarled trunks of ancient trees. "See what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're watching us. They've been following since the river." Her voice had acquired a trembling quality I'd never heard before. I placed my hands on her shoulders, turning her gently to face me. There's nothing there, Ivy. I think we're both getting tired and maybe a little spooked by this place. Let's take another break, have some water. She jerked away from my touch with unexpected violence. Don't patronize me, she snapped, her voice rising sharply. I know what I saw. The outburst was so uncharacteristic that I stepped back involuntarily. In 4 years together, through countless stressful situations, I had never seen Ivy react with such sudden hostility. I'm sorry, I said carefully. I didn't mean to dismiss what you're experiencing. Tell me what you saw. Her expression cycled rapidly through emotions: anger, fear, confusion, and finally, a disturbing blankness. I don't know now. Something moving in the trees, watching. She rubbed her temples. My head really hurts. Concern overrode my own discomfort. Let's sit down. I have some pain relievers in the first aid kit. I guided her to a relatively clear spot and helped her remove her backpack. As I searched through my pack for the medication, I noticed Ivy's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Her skin, normally warm-toned, had taken on an ashen quality, and a thin sheen of sweat covered her forehead despite the cool air. Here, take these. I offered her 2 tablets and my water bottle. Maybe we're dealing with altitude sickness or something. She accepted the medication without comment, swallowing the pills mechanically. Then she stared at the water bottle in her hands as though she couldn't quite remember what it was for. Ivy? I prompted gently. Her head snapped up, eyes widening as she looked past me into the forest. We need to go, she whispered urgently. Now they're getting closer. The transformation in Ivy accelerated as we resumed our hike. Gone was her usual thoughtful, measured demeanor, replaced by something frenetic and unpredictable. She walked several paces ahead of me, her movements alternating between a cautious creep and sudden bursts of almost running. Every few minutes she would freeze, head tilted as though listening to sounds I couldn't detect. The forest had grown darker much earlier than it should have. Though my watch insisted it was only 4:30 p.m., the light filtering through the canopy had the dim, golden quality of approaching sunset. Shadows stretched impossible distances, creating patterns that seemed to move independently of their sources. We need to think about heading back, I called to Ivy. It'll be dark in a couple of hours. She didn't acknowledge me, continuing her erratic progress forward. When I jogged to catch up with her, she flinched away from my approach. Don't touch me, she warned, her voice a harsh whisper that barely resembled her normal tones. They might notice you too. I tried to maintain my composure despite the cold fear spreading through my chest. Who might notice, Ivy? There's no one here but us. She laughed, a short, ugly sound utterly unlike her usual warm chuckle. You're so blind. They're everywhere, in the trees, under the ground, watching, waiting. I took a deep breath, fighting my own increasing paranoia. One of us needed to remain rational, and Ivy was clearly losing her grip on reality. I think you might be having some kind of reaction to something. Maybe a plant we brushed against. We need to get back to the car, maybe find a hospital. Hospital won't help, she muttered. They can't stop what's coming. I decided to try a different approach. What exactly do you think is coming, Ivy? Help me understand what you're experiencing. She stopped so suddenly I nearly collided with her again. When she turned to face me, her expression had changed completely. The paranoia replaced by a cold, evaluating look that seemed to assess my worth as one might examine an insect. You're one of them, aren't you? She asked, her voice eerily calm. You've been one of them all along. Before I could respond, she reached out with surprising speed and grabbed my wrist, her fingers digging in with painful intensity. How long have you been watching me? How long have you been pretending? Ivy, you're hurting me, I said as calmly as I could manage. I'm not pretending anything. I'm me, the same person you've known for 4 years. Liar, she hissed, releasing my wrist with a violent shove that nearly sent me stumbling into a tree. You think I don't see the way you change when I'm not looking directly at you? The way your face slips? The genuine horror in her voice triggered an involuntary response. I touched my own face as though to confirm its solidity. My face isn't slipping, Ivy. I think you might be hallucinating. That's exactly what you would say, she cried, backing away from me. You want me to doubt myself, to think I'm crazy. But I see you now. I see what you really are. She turned and bolted down the trail, moving with a desperate speed that seemed impossible given her earlier fatigue. I called after her, then cursed and gave chase, terrified she would injure herself in her panicked flight. The forest blurred around me as I ran, branches whipping my face and arms. The path twisted unpredictably, making it difficult to keep Ivy in sight. My lungs burned, and the persistent headache throbbed in time with my racing pulse. I found her in a small clearing about a quarter-mile ahead, standing perfectly still in its center. The area was unusual, a perfect circle of treeless ground approximately 30 feet in diameter. No underbrush grew here, just a carpet of unnaturally uniform moss covering the entire space. "Ivy," I called cautiously, remaining at the edge of the clearing. Something about the space felt wrong. The air above it seemed to waver slightly, like heat rising from hot pavement. She didn't turn or acknowledge my presence. Her stillness was absolute, not even the rise and fall of breathing visible in her silhouette. "Ivy, please," I tried again, taking a tentative step into the clearing. "Whatever you're experiencing, we'll figure it out together. But we need to get out of these woods before dark." Slowly, with a jerky movement that reminded me of damaged film footage, she turned to face me. Her expression was completely vacant, eyes staring through me rather than at me. Then, without warning, her features contorted into a mask of pure terror. The scream that erupted from her shattered the forest's unnatural silence, a sound of such primal fear that the hairs on my arms and neck rose in immediate response. It wasn't a scream of surprise or momentary alarm, but the sustained wail of someone confronting incomprehensible horror. I rushed forward instinctively, reaching for her, but before I could make contact, her behavior shifted again. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by wild, disjointed laughter. Her arms began to flail as though fighting off invisible attackers approaching from all sides. "Get them off!" she shrieked between bursts of laughter. "They're crawling on me. Get them off." She clawed at her own skin, nails leaving red trails along her arms and neck. I grabbed for her hands, trying to prevent her from injuring herself further, but her panic gave her unusual strength. One of her wildly swinging arms caught me directly in the temple, knocking my glasses off and sending me staggering backward. The world immediately dissolved into a blur of indistinct shapes and colors. Without my glasses, I was functionally blind beyond a few inches from my face. Dropping to my hands and knees, I began frantically searching the moss for the lost eyewear. The situation now doubly terrifying with my impaired vision. Through the auditory chaos of Ivy's continued screams and my own panicked breathing, I became aware of another sound, a low, rhythmic humming emanating from the ground itself. The moss beneath my searching hands seemed to vibrate with it, the sensation traveling up my arms and resonating in my chest cavity. My fingers finally closed around the familiar shape of my glasses. I jammed them onto my face, the world snapping back into focus just in time to see Ivy sprinting from the clearing, heading deeper into the woods, away from the trail we had been following. "Ivy!" "Stop!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet and pursuing her once more. The forest beyond the clearing was different, older, untouched. The trees here were massive, their trunks wider than my arm span, their bark black with age and moisture. No trail existed here, just spaces between the enormous trees where undergrowth couldn't establish itself due to lack of sunlight. I ran blindly, guided only by the sounds of Ivy crashing through the vegetation ahead of me. My foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling face first into the damp earth. I tasted blood, felt the sharp sting of a cut lip, but pushed myself up immediately. "Ivy!" I called again, my voice echoing strangely among the massive trunks. The crashing sounds had stopped. The forest had fallen completely silent. Not even the ambient noises of insects or wind remained. I strained to hear any indication of Ivy's direction, turning slowly in place as panic threatened to overwhelm my rational thought. A sound finally broke the silence. A soft, broken sobbing coming from somewhere to my left. I moved cautiously toward it, pushing aside ferns and navigating around the huge trees until I found her. Ivy sat on the ground, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around them. Her body shook with each sob, her face buried against her knees. I approached slowly, as one might a wounded animal, alert for any sign that she might bolt again. "Ivy," I said softly. "It's me. I'm here to help you." Her sobbing stopped abruptly. When she raised her head, her face was streaked with dirt and tears, eyes red-rimmed and swollen. But what struck me most was the expression, raw terror mixed with a pleading desperation. "Make them stop," she whispered. "Please make them stop talking to me." I knelt beside her, close but not touching. "Who's talking to you, Ivy?" "The trees," she replied, her voice childlike in its simplicity. "They say terrible things. Things that can't be true." "What kind of things?" I asked, trying to understand what she was experiencing. Her eyes widened. "They say you're not real, that none of this is real, that I've been asleep for years and this is all just a dream I'm having while my real body rots somewhere dark." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "They say I'll never wake up because I'm already dead." A cold weight settled in my stomach. Whatever was happening to Ivy went beyond a simple allergic reaction or exhaustion. Something fundamental had broken in her perception of reality, and I had no idea how to fix it. "The trees are lying," I said firmly. "This is real." "I'm real. You're alive and we're going to get out of these woods together." She stared at me, desperate hope flickering in her expression. "Promise?" "I promise," I said, extending my hand. "But we need to start heading back now. Will you come with me?" She hesitated, then slowly reached out. Her fingers were ice cold when they touched mine. I helped her to her feet, noticing how she swayed slightly as though maintaining balance required conscious effort. "Which way?" she asked in a small voice. I looked around, realizing with a sinking feeling that I'd lost all sense of direction during the chase. The monotonous landscape of identical massive trees offered no clues, and the thick canopy obscured the sky, preventing me from using the sun as a reference point. "Let me check something," I said, pulling out my phone. As expected in the remote forest, there was no signal, but the compass app should still work. The screen remained dark when I pressed the power button. Dead battery? Impossible. It had been at 83% when I last checked it less than an hour ago. Fighting down rising panic, I tried to think logically. We had been heading roughly east on the trail before Ivy's breakdown. If we now headed west, we should eventually intersect the trail again, or at least reach the river, which we could then follow back toward the parking area. "This way," I said with more confidence than I felt, pointing in what I hoped was westward. "Stay close to me, okay?" Ivy nodded, her hand tightening around mine. We began walking, picking our way carefully through the trackless forest. The light continued to fade rapidly, the spaces between trees growing darker until they resembled black portals into nothingness. Time became difficult to track as we walked. My watch had stopped at 5:17, the second hand frozen in place. I estimated we had perhaps an hour of usable light left, though it was difficult to be certain given how unnaturally the darkness seemed to be gathering. Ivy remained largely silent as we walked, occasionally whimpering or jerking her head as though responding to sounds I couldn't hear. Her hand in mine was my only reassurance that she was still with me, still functioning on some basic level. After what felt like hours of walking but was likely only 40 minutes, the forest began to thin slightly. The massive trees became less frequent, interspersed with younger growth. Hope sparked, were we approaching the edge of this ancient section? Then I spotted something that made me stop abruptly, a flash of color among the monotonous browns and greens. Drawing closer, I recognized one of the blue trailblazes painted on a tree trunk. "Look," I said to Ivy, pointing. "We found the trail again." She stared at the mark without comprehension, then at me. "What does it mean?" "It means we can follow these markers back to the car," I explained patiently. "We're going to be okay." A strange expression crossed her face, something between relief and disappointment. "They said we'd never find the way out, that we'd walk in circles until we collapsed." "They were wrong," I said firmly, tugging her toward the marked path. "Come on." The trail was barely visible in the fading light, but the blue blazes provided enough guidance to keep us on track. We moved as quickly as Ivy's unsteady gait would allow, following the markers in what I hoped was the direction back toward the parking area. The forest sounds had begun to return, intermittent rustling in the undergrowth, the occasional call of a bird preparing to roost for the night. Each noise made Ivy flinch, but she continued forward, her grip on my hand almost painful in its intensity. "They're still watching," she murmured after a particularly loud crack from somewhere in the darkness to our right. "They're angry we're trying to leave." I chose not to engage with her delusions, focusing instead on maintaining our pace and watching for trail markers. The path had begun to ascend gradually, a good sign, as it meant we were likely moving away from the river valley and back toward higher ground. Darkness had nearly completed its conquest of the forest when we reached a fork in the trail. One path continued upward while the other descended again toward what I assumed was the river. Neither direction showed clear signs of being the main trail versus a side path. I stopped considering our options. Continuing uphill seemed logical if we wanted to reach the parking area, which had been on a ridge. But without a functioning phone or watch and with no map landmarks visible in the growing darkness, certainty was impossible. "Which way?" Ivy asked, her voice stronger than it had been since her episode began. I studied her face in the dim light. Some clarity had returned to her eyes, though she still seemed disoriented. "You feeling any better?" I asked cautiously. She frowned, seeming to consider the question seriously. "My head still hurts, and I keep hearing things, but they're quieter now." She looked around. "Where are we? How did we get off the trail?" The fact that she recognized we had deviated from our original route was encouraging. "You had some kind of episode," I explained gently. "You ran off the trail and I followed you. We're trying to find our way back to the car now." Her frown deepened. "Episode? What do you mean?" "You started acting strange, saying you saw things, heard things. You ran away from me, screaming about something attacking you." I hesitated. "Do you not remember any of that?" Ivy's free hand rose to her mouth in horror. "No. I remember starting to feel strange after lunch. Everything got wavy, colors were wrong, and there were whispers." She trailed off, shaking her head, "But I don't remember running or screaming." Relief flooded through me. This was the most rational Ivy had sounded in hours. "I think you might have had a reaction to something in these woods, maybe a plant you touched or some spores you breathed in. But you seem to be coming back to yourself now." She nodded slowly. "I still feel off, but clearer, I think." She glanced at the fork in the trail. "We should go up." The parking lot was on high ground. "That's what I was thinking," I agreed, heartened by her return to logical thinking. We took the upward path, moving more confidently now that Ivy seemed more stable. The trail was becoming increasingly difficult to see in the darkness, but the blue blazes, when we could spot them, confirmed we remained en route. As we climbed higher, the air grew noticeably fresher, the oppressive quality that had characterized the forest near the river, dissipating with each foot of elevation we gained. My own headache, which had become such a constant companion that I'd almost stopped registering it, began to recede. "I'm sorry," Ivy said suddenly as we paused to rest on a fallen log. "For whatever happened back there, for whatever I said or did." "You don't need to apologize," I assured her. "You weren't yourself. Something affected you, affected both of us, I think, though you got hit harder." She nodded, staring at her hands. "I remember fragments now, feelings more than specific events. Terror. Absolute certainty that something was hunting us, watching us." She shuddered. It felt so real. "Hallucinations often do," I said. "When I was a kid, I had a high fever once, 106 degrees. I was absolutely convinced that the ceiling was melting and dripping onto me. My mother couldn't convince me otherwise until the fever broke." Ivy managed a weak smile. "This was like that, but worse. Because part of me knew something was wrong with my perception, but I couldn't stop believing what I was seeing and hearing." A thought occurred to me. "What's the last thing you clearly remember? Before things got strange?" She considered for a moment. "We were by the river having lunch. You asked if I heard something, whispers, you said. I didn't hear anything then." Her eyes widened. "You were affected first." The realization hit me with unexpected force. She was right. My sense of wrongness had preceded hers by at least an hour. The whispers from the river, the paranoia, the sensation of being watched, all had started with me, not Ivy. "You're right," I admitted. "But you had a much stronger reaction eventually." "Maybe I'm more sensitive to whatever it was," she suggested. "Or maybe my exposure was greater somehow." We fell silent, both contemplating the implications. Something in that forest had affected our minds. Something natural and explicable, I insisted to myself, despite the lingering echo of supernatural dread that the experience had instilled. After a few more minutes of rest, we continued our ascent. The trail grew steeper, requiring more exertion to navigate. The physical effort seemed to further ground Ivy in reality. The concentration required to place her feet securely on the uneven ground, leaving less room for lingering hallucinations. About half an hour later, we emerged from the densest part of the forest onto a ridge dotted with smaller trees. The sky opened up above us, revealing a canopy of stars and a quarter moon that provided enough light to see by. The sight of open sky after hours in the claustrophobic forest was indescribably comforting. "I think I recognize this," Ivy said, pointing ahead to where the ridge curved. There was a lookout point near the beginning of our hike, a cleared area with a view of the valley. I strained to recall the early part of our journey, which now seemed days rather than hours ago. "You're right. If we can find that lookout, we should be able to orient ourselves back to the parking area." With renewed purpose, we followed the ridgeline. Within 10 minutes, we located the lookout, a natural clearing at the edge of a cliff offering spectacular views of the darkened valley below. In the far distance, the lights of a small town twinkled. Civilization, a comforting reminder that the entire world had not been consumed by this forest. From the lookout, a wider, more established trail led back in the direction of the parking area. Relief washed over me as we stepped onto it. This was clearly the main path, well-maintained and marked with frequent blazes. "We're going to make it," I said, squeezing Ivy's hand. She nodded, a genuine smile forming. "Thank God. I never want to go through something like that again." As we walked the final stretch toward the parking area, Ivy's condition continued to improve. Her movements became more coordinated, her conversation more coherent. By the time the gravel lot came into view, with my solitary car still parked where we had left it that morning, she seemed almost back to normal, exhausted and subdued, but essentially herself. The drive home began in exhausted silence. I had decided against camping. Neither of us wanted to spend another minute in those woods, and though Ivy seemed significantly improved, I wasn't confident the improvement would last. About 20 minutes into the journey, as we merged onto the highway that would take us back to the city, Ivy finally spoke. "I think I know what happened to us back there," she said quietly, staring out the passenger window at the darkness beyond. I glanced at her, then back at the road. "What's your theory?" "Remember that article we read last month? About that research team studying mushroom networks in old-growth forests?" She turned to face me. "They discovered that some fungal species release spores containing compounds similar to psilocybin, but more complex, with effects that can last hours and vary widely between individuals." The article had been fascinating, part of our Sunday morning routine of sharing interesting scientific findings over coffee. "You think we inhaled hallucinogenic fungal spores?" She nodded. "It explains everything. The progression of symptoms, the way they affected us differently, how they intensified in certain areas of the forest and diminished as we gained elevation and distance." Her explanation was rational, scientific, and completely plausible. It offered the comfort of the known, a framework for understanding the terrifying experience we had endured. Yet something in me resisted it, not because I believed something supernatural had occurred, but because the explanation seemed too neat, too convenient. "Maybe," I conceded. "But why haven't we heard of other hikers experiencing similar effects in those woods? That trail is well established. Hundreds of people must walk it every year." Ivy considered this. "Perhaps the conditions have to be just right. Humidity, temperature, the life cycle of the fungi. Or maybe it only affects certain people with particular sensitivities." She paused. "Or maybe it does happen to others, but they're too embarrassed or confused to report it. Who wants to admit they completely lost touch with reality while hiking?" Her arguments were logical. I found myself wanting to accept them, to file away our experience under unusual but explainable natural phenomena, and move on. But the memory of those whispers from the river, of the way the forest had seemed to deliberately lead us astray, lingered uncomfortably. "You mentioned remembering fragments," I said. "What exactly do you remember saying or doing during your episode?" Ivy was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice was barely audible over the car's engine. "I remember being absolutely certain that the forest was alive, not in the normal way, but consciously, malevolently alive. That the trees were communicating with each other about us, planning something. She swallowed audibly. And I remember thinking you weren't really you anymore, that something had replaced you when I wasn't looking. The description sent a chill through me despite the car's heater, running at full blast. It aligned too perfectly with the behavior I had witnessed. Her suspicion, her terror when looking at me, her conviction that something was hunting us. Classic paranoid hallucination, I said, trying to sound casual. Common with certain psychedelics. Right, she agreed quickly. Textbook, really. We both seemed eager to rationalize, to normalize what had happened. Perhaps that was the healthiest approach, to acknowledge the experience while framing it within understandable parameters. We should probably get checked out when we get back, I suggested. Just to be safe. Some toxins can have delayed effects. Ivy nodded. Urgent care should still be open when we get to the city. The remainder of the drive passed in easier conversation, as though having established a rational explanation had freed us to distance ourselves from the experience. We discussed work, upcoming plans, mundane topics that helped anchor us back in our normal reality. By the time we reached the outskirts of the city, Ivy had fallen asleep, her head resting against the passenger window. In sleep, her face had relaxed completely, the lingering tension from our ordeal finally releasing its hold. I stole glances at her as I drove, reassuring myself that she was truly recovering. Each mile that separated us from Ravenwood Forest seemed to restore another small piece of normalcy. Yet as the city lights grew brighter around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had brought something back with us. Not a physical entity, but an awareness, a knowledge that the world contained experiences that defied simple explanation, that the boundary between the known and the incomprehensible was far more permeable than we preferred to believe. The urgent care doctor found nothing physically wrong with either of us. Our vital signs were normal, pupil responses appropriate, no evidence of lasting toxic effects. When we described our symptoms, carefully edited to sound less alarming, she suggested mild heat exhaustion combined with dehydration, perhaps exacerbated by contact with an irritant plant like poison oak. The mind can play tricks when the body is stressed, she explained, prescribing nothing stronger than rest, fluids, and over-the-counter pain relievers for our lingering headaches, especially in unfamiliar environments where the usual reference points are absent. We accepted her diagnosis gratefully, clinging to its comforting mundanity. On the drive home from the clinic, we stopped for takeout, neither of us having the energy to cook, and ate in near silence in our apartment, the familiar surroundings gradually working to dispel the lingering unease. That night we slept with all the lights on, neither of us willing to acknowledge why. The following days brought a gradual return to routine. We went to work, interacted with colleagues, watched our favorite shows, all the normal activities that constituted our lives before Ravenwood. Yet something had shifted between us, an unspoken understanding that we had shared an experience that had fundamentally altered our perception of reality. Ivy researched fungi extensively in her spare time, building an impressive case file for her theory. She found scientific papers documenting the psychoactive properties of certain rare mushroom species, found primarily in old-growth forests of our region. Some of these compounds had been shown to cause precisely the symptoms we had experienced: auditory and visual hallucinations, paranoia, time distortion, and in some cases, temporary personality changes. I supported her research even as I privately harbored doubts. Not because I believed something supernatural had occurred, but because the experience had felt too intentional, as though the forest had been testing us, probing for weaknesses, seeking something I couldn't articulate. A week after our hike, I woke in the middle of the night to find Ivy's side of the bed empty. I found her in the living room, staring out the window at the city lights, arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Can't sleep?" I asked, joining her by the window. She didn't look at me. "I keep dreaming about it, not just remembering what happened, but continuing it, like there's more to the story that we didn't experience while we were there." I waited, sensing she had more to say. "In the dreams, we never left the forest," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We just think we did. We think we're home safe, but it's all an illusion created by whatever's there, to keep us complacent while it finishes what it started." The statement resonated uncomfortably with thoughts I'd been carefully avoiding. That's just your brain processing the experience, I said, placing a hand on her shoulder. Trauma can do that, create worst-case scenarios that play out in dreams. She nodded, but didn't seem convinced. Maybe, but what if... It's not, I interrupted more firmly than I intended. We're home. This is real. How can you be so sure? She challenged, turning to face me. If the hallucinations could make us believe what we experienced in the forest was real, how can we trust that this isn't just another layer of the same delusion? The question struck at the heart of what had been troubling me as well. How could we ever be certain of the boundaries between reality and perception? If our minds could be so thoroughly compromised by something as simple as fungal spores, what did that say about the reliability of consciousness itself? Because this feels right, I said finally. The forest felt wrong, like wearing someone else's clothes. This feels like us. She seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly. I suppose that's all we can really go on, isn't it? What feels true? We returned to bed, holding each other more tightly than usual. Sleep eventually came, but brought with it dreams of towering trees and whispered voices just beyond comprehension. In the weeks that followed, we gradually spoke of Ravenwood less frequently. The experience receded in our daily consciousness, relegated to an unusual anecdote rather than an active concern. Yet neither of us suggested hiking again, even as summer transitioned to fall and the forests beckoned with their changing colors. 2 months after our experience, I found myself researching the history of Ravenwood State Forest during a slow afternoon at work. Most of what I found was predictably mundane. Established as a protected area in the 1950s, home to several endangered species, popular with hikers and nature photographers. Then I discovered an archived newspaper article from 1978, describing the disappearance of 2 university students who had gone hiking in the deepest section of Ravenwood. They had been missing for 3 days when one of them stumbled out of the woods, disoriented and suffering from dehydration. He described becoming separated from his companion after both experienced what he called a shared hallucination that made them flee from perceived threats. Despite extensive searches, the second student was never found. The article quoted a local botanist who suggested that certain rare fungi in the old growth section of the forest might produce spores with hallucinogenic properties. The theory was dismissed by authorities as speculative, but no other explanation was ever established for what the survivors described experiencing. I closed the browser window without mentioning my discovery to Ivy. There seemed no point in reopening wounds that were finally beginning to heal. But that night I dreamed of the circular clearing with its carpet of moss, and of something vast and patient waiting beneath the forest floor, sending its chemical messengers into the air like invisible tendrils, reaching for minds to explore. We never returned to Ravenwood. A year later, we moved to a different state for new job opportunities, putting physical distance between ourselves and those woods. Our relationship survived, though something subtle had changed. A shared awareness that the world contained depths we had only briefly glimpsed, realities that existed alongside our own, but remained largely inaccessible to ordinary perception. Sometimes, on nights when sleep proves elusive, I find myself wondering about that forest. Is it still there, waiting for unwary hikers to wander into its heart? Does it remember us, the 2 who escaped its influence? And most troubling of all, did we truly escape, or did it simply allow us to believe we had? I've researched extensively since then, learning about various plants that can cause hallucinations, fever, even temporary psychosis. Science offers rational explanations for everything we experienced, yet rationality feels somehow insufficient in the face of memory. The whispers from the river, the watching presence among the trees, the sense of a vast intelligence stirring beneath the surface of perception. In the end, I've settled for uncertainty, an acceptance that some experiences defy complete understanding. The forest taught us that the line between the known and the unknown is far more permeable than we prefer to believe, and that perhaps the greatest wisdom lies in acknowledging the limits of our comprehension. We still hike occasionally, in carefully selected parks with well-traveled trails and open vistas. But we stay away from old-growth forests, from places where ancient trees cluster too closely together, from shadows that seem deeper than they should be. And we never, ever venture far from the marked path. The mountains had always called to me. Even as a child growing up in the suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, I felt drawn to the ancient ridges that punctuated the horizon. Now at 38, I found myself parking my weathered Subaru at the trailhead of Crow's Ridge Trail on a crisp October morning in 2018. The aspens shimmered gold against the backdrop of towering pines, their leaves performing a delicate dance in the autumn breeze. I adjusted my backpack straps and checked my trail map one last time. The 6-mile loop was considered moderate by experienced hikers, but its remote location in Appalachian backcountry meant encountering few, if any, fellow travelers. Perfect for clearing my head after months of grueling work at the hospital. As a trauma nurse, I'd seen enough broken bodies and shattered lives to last several lifetimes. The trail began gently enough, winding through dense undergrowth and occasional clearings that offered breathtaking views of the valley below. The rhythmic crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the distant calls of birds created a peaceful soundtrack. I breathed deeply, filling my lungs with the earthy scent of decomposing foliage and pine. About 2 miles in, I noticed the first oddity: boot prints in the mud that weren't mine. Large military-style treads that suggested someone substantial was ahead of me on the trail. I thought nothing of it initially. Public trails meant public access, after all. But something about the deliberate, measured spacing of the footprints triggered a faint unease in my subconscious. I paused at a stream crossing to refill my water bottle, letting the cold mountain water run over my fingers. That's when I heard it. The snap of a branch that seemed too deliberate, too close. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing beyond the endless columns of pine standing like silent watchers. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes following my every move. "Hello?" I called, receiving only the mockery of my own echo in response. The wind changed direction, bringing with it a scent that didn't belong. Cigarette smoke mingled with something else, something that reminded me of the hospital's morgue. My fingers trembled slightly as I secured my water bottle and continued up the trail, my pace quickening despite my efforts to remain calm. By early afternoon, the trail had steepened considerably, and sweat trickled down my spine despite the cool temperature. The forest had changed character, the friendly aspens giving way to gnarled oaks and thick pines that blocked much of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight beneath their canopy. I rounded a sharp bend and froze. 30 feet ahead stood a man, his back to me, seemingly studying the forest floor. Even from behind, something about his posture sent warning signals racing through my nervous system. He was tall, lean but wiry, wearing a faded camouflage jacket that had seen better days. A hunting knife hung from his belt, and nearby, a large German shepherd sat watching the trail, watching me. I considered backtracking quietly, but at that moment the dog's ears perked up and it gave a low growl. The man turned slowly and our eyes met across the distance. "Beautiful day for hiking," he called, his voice surprisingly gentle for his rugged appearance. His face was weathered, deeply lined around pale blue eyes that didn't match his smiling mouth. I placed him in his early 60s, though something about his movement suggested the vitality of someone younger. "Yes, perfect weather," I replied, forcing casualness into my voice while calculating the distance back to my car. "You're quite a ways from the trailhead," he observed, taking a step toward me. "Not many folks come out this far. Most turn back at Widow's Creek." I hadn't remembered passing any creek with such an ominous name. "I enjoy the solitude," I said, then immediately regretted revealing that I appreciated being alone. "Same here," he nodded, closing more distance between us. "Name's Russell Jenkins. This here's Comet." He gestured to the dog, which continued to watch me with unnerving intensity. I offered a false name, a habit from years of working with unstable patients. "I'm Kate, nice to meet you." Russell's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Where you headed, Kate?" "Summit's another 3 miles, pretty rough terrain. Just enjoying the walk. I might turn around soon." I gestured vaguely behind me. "Shame to come all this way and not see the view," Russell said. "I'm headed up myself. Happy to have company." The trail was narrow here. Passing him would require coming within arm's reach. Every instinct screamed danger. "Actually, I just remembered I promised to meet friends back in town for dinner," I lied, taking a step backward. "I should start heading back." A shadow passed over Russell's face, his smile faltering for just a moment before returning with increased intensity. "Sure thing. Maybe I'll see you on my way down." I nodded and continued my retreat, fighting the urge to run. Only when I'd put several bends in the trail between us did I allow myself to look back. The path behind me was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Russell Jenkins hadn't continued toward the summit at all. The descent should have been easier than the climb, but fear made every step treacherous. Twice I nearly twisted an ankle on loose rocks as I hurried down the trail, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest that had seemed so welcoming in the morning now felt oppressive, full of hidden threats and watching eyes. I passed a junction I didn't remember from the ascent and paused, disoriented. The trail map showed I should turn right to continue back to the parking area, but something felt wrong. I studied the ground, looking for my own boot prints from earlier. Instead, I found those same military-style treads, Russell's boots, heading down the right fork. They looked fresh. My heart hammered against my ribs. How had he gotten ahead of me? I hadn't passed him, and there were no connecting trails marked on my map. Unless he knew these mountains well enough to navigate off-trail. I took the left fork instead, reasoning that a longer route back to civilization was preferable to encountering Russell again. This path was less maintained, with fallen trees forcing detours and thick underbrush, sometimes obscuring the way entirely. The afternoon light was fading fast, filtering through the canopy in increasingly muted rays. After 20 minutes of difficult hiking, I came upon a small clearing containing a primitive campsite, a fire ring of stones, blackened from recent use, and a flat area where a tent had clearly stood recently. Empty cans of beans and tuna had been tossed carelessly aside, along with cigarette butts bearing the same brand I'd smelled earlier. Worst of all was what hung from a nearby tree branch. Animal carcasses in various states of decomposition. Most appeared to be squirrels and rabbits, but one larger shape made my stomach lurch. A dog collar dangled from the branch, tag still attached. I backed away from the campsite, bile rising in my throat. Whatever Russell Jenkins was, he wasn't just an ordinary hiker. The collection of dead animals displayed like trophies suggested something far more disturbing. As I turned to leave, my foot knocked against something half buried in leaves. I stared down at a woman's hiking boot, relatively new, with distinctive red laces. Inside was a sock, and inside that, I staggered backward, my scream trapped in my throat. From somewhere in the forest, a dog barked once. The sound unnaturally close. I ran. Dusk descended rapidly in the mountains, the forest transforming from shadowy green to impenetrable black within minutes. I had no flashlight. My phone battery had died hours ago, and my headlamp remained in my car, a casualty of my overconfidence in returning before dark. The trail had become nearly invisible, forcing me to feel my way forward with outstretched hands and cautious steps. Every snapping twig caused my heart to stutter. Each rustling leaf became Russell's footsteps closing in. The forest seemed alive with malevolent intent, shapes moving at the periphery of my vision only to dissolve when I turned to confront them. I stumbled into a clearing and looked up, hoping to use the stars for navigation. Instead, heavy clouds obscured the night sky, promising rain. As if on cue, the first fat droplets began to fall, quickly building to a steady downpour that soaked through my lightweight jacket. Finding shelter became my immediate priority. I backtracked to a cluster of boulders I'd passed moments before, feeling along their rough surfaces until I discovered a shallow overhang. I crawled beneath it, hugging my knees to my chest as water cascaded in sheets just inches from my feet. Thunder crashed overhead, momentarily illuminating the forest in stark relief. In that flash, I saw something that stopped my breath. A figure standing motionless among the trees, watching my hiding place. When darkness returned, I strained my eyes uselessly against the blackness, unsure if I'd seen anything at all. Minutes ticked by, each one an eternity of heightened senses and imagined threats. The rain intensified, drumming against the forest floor and creating rivulets that ran beneath my shelter, gradually soaking my boots and pants. Another lightning flash, closer this time. The figure was gone or had moved. I bit down on my hand to stifle a whimper. Between thunderclaps, I heard something else, the methodical sound of boots squelching through mud, circling my position. Deliberately slow, hunting steps. "I know these woods better than anyone, Kate." Russell's voice came suddenly, impossibly close. Been coming here 30 years. Seen all kinds of folks get lost. Terrible things happen to lost hikers. I pressed myself against the cold stone at my back, praying the darkness concealed me as effectively as it blinded me. "Your friends in town," he continued conversationally, as if we were chatting over coffee. "The ones you're meeting for dinner. What are their names?" My silence answered him more truthfully than any lie could have. "That's what I thought," he said, his voice now directly above me. "No one knows you're here, do they?" I lunged from my hiding place, choosing action over certain capture. I collided with a solid form, not Russell, but his dog, Comet. The animal's growl vibrated through my bones as powerful jaws snapped inches from my face. I twisted away, kicking blindly, and felt my foot connect with something solid. The dog yelped and fell back. I ran again, abandoning the trail entirely, crashing through underbrush as branches whipped my face and tore at my clothes. Behind me, Russell shouted commands to the dog, his voice containing an edge of excitement that terrified me more than anger would have. The ground suddenly disappeared beneath my feet. I was falling, tumbling down a steep embankment, unable to stop my descent as rocks and roots battered my body. When I finally came to rest, it was in the shallow water of what must have been Widow's Creek. I lay stunned in the freezing water, pain radiating from everywhere at once. When I tried to stand, my left ankle gave way, sending me crashing back into the stream. Not broken, I assessed automatically. My nurse's training taking over, but badly sprained. Walking would be possible, but agonizing. Above me, I could hear Russell and his dog moving along the ridge, searching for a way down. I had minutes at most before they found a path to the creek. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I pulled myself upright using a nearby sapling and tested my weight on the injured ankle. It held, barely. The creek offered a path of sorts, less vegetated than the surrounding forest and slightly more visible in the darkness. I began to limp downstream, hoping it would lead to a road or cabin where I might find help. Each step was torment, but fear provided powerful motivation. The rain continued unabated, quickly soaking me to the skin and lowering my core temperature to dangerous levels. Hypothermia would be as deadly as Russell if I didn't find shelter soon. After what seemed like hours of painful progress, the creek widened and the trees thinned. Through the curtain of rain, I made out a dark shape, rectangular and unnatural against the organic lines of the forest. A cabin. No lights shone from within, but it represented my only hope of survival. I approached cautiously, aware that any structure in these remote woods might be Russell's own hideaway. When no dog barked and no movement came from within, I hobbled to the door and tried the handle. Locked. Desperation drove me to the nearest window. Using my elbow, I broke the glass, the sound shockingly loud in the nighttime forest. I reached through carefully, found the latch, and pushed the window open. With considerable effort, I hauled myself inside, collapsing onto a wooden floor in a puddle of rainwater and blood from numerous cuts. The cabin was small, one room with basic furnishings. A wood stove sat cold in the corner. A narrow bed with a bare mattress stood against one wall. A rough wooden table and 2 chairs comprised the only other furniture. Dust covered everything, suggesting the cabin hadn't been used in some time. I dragged myself to the door and secured the flimsy lock, then pushed the table against it for good measure. The broken window remained a vulnerability, but I lacked the strength to barricade it effectively. After finding matches in a drawer, I managed to light the stub of a candle, its flickering glow revealing more details of my temporary sanctuary. Canned goods lined a shelf, someone's emergency supplies, a rifle rack hung on the wall, empty. Most disturbing were the photographs tacked to the walls, dozens of them showing hikers on various trails, all taken from a distance, without the subject's knowledge. In many, faces were circled with red marker. With trembling hands, I searched for a first aid kit, finding a dusty box under the bed. I cleaned my worst cuts as best I could and fashioned a compression wrap for my ankle from a torn pillowcase. My wet clothes would accelerate hypothermia, so I stripped them off and wrapped myself in a musty blanket found in a trunk. As I worked, I tried to formulate a plan. The cabin offered temporary shelter, but Russell clearly knew these mountains intimately. It was only a matter of time before he tracked me here. I needed to dry out, warm up, and move on before dawn. The candle guttered suddenly, though no draft disturbed the stale air. I froze, listening intently. Through the continued drumming of rain on the roof, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the cabin's small porch. The door handle jiggled experimentally. When it didn't yield, a voice called through the wood. "Open up, Kate, you're hurt. I can help." Russell's tone was reasonable, concerned even, the voice of a good Samaritan offering assistance to a lost hiker. Only the circumstances revealed the lie. I remained absolutely still, not even daring to breathe. "I know you're in there," he continued. "Saw the candlelight. You broke the Sanderson window." A pause. "They haven't used this place in years. Not since their boy went missing on the trail." The information chilled me further. Russell knew the cabin owners personally, knew their history. How long had he haunted these mountains, watching, waiting, hunting? "I'm getting soaked out here," he said, a note of irritation creeping into his voice. "Be reasonable. That ankle needs proper attention. I was a medic in the Army. I can wrap it properly." When I didn't respond, he sighed audibly. "Have it your way." Something heavy crashed against the door, making the table leg scratch across the floor. Again the impact came, and I realized he was using his shoulder as a battering ram. The old wood groaned but held. I extinguished the candle and moved to the window I'd broken earlier. If he forced the door, I'd have no choice but to escape the way I'd entered, injured ankle or not. The assault on the door stopped suddenly. Footsteps circled the cabin, heading toward the broken window. I retreated to the farthest corner, clutching a can of beans as my only weapon. Russell's face appeared at the window, water streaming from his sodden hair. In the brief flashes of lightning, he looked skeletal, all pretense of normalcy stripped away. "You've made things difficult, Kate," he said quietly. "I like that. The others gave up too easily. No sport in it. The others." The implication of those two words sent ice through my veins. He began clearing the broken glass from the window frame methodically, preparing to climb through. I raised the can, knowing how pathetically inadequate it would be against his hunting knife. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Something massive crashed nearby, a tree struck by lightning toppling to earth. Russell turned instinctively toward the sound. In that moment of distraction, I lunged forward and brought the can down on his fingers where they gripped the window frame. He howled in pain and withdrew his hand. I slammed the window shut and threw the latch, trapping a scrap of his jacket. His face contorted with rage, all pretense abandoned. "I'm going to take my time with you," he snarled. "Days, not hours." I backed away from the window, searching frantically for another weapon, anything more substantial than a can. Finding nothing, I turned my attention to the wood stove. If I could light a fire, perhaps I could fashion a torch for self-defense. As I gathered kindling from a small pile beside the stove, I heard Russell moving again, this time to the rear of the cabin. A new sound joined the storm, the systematic thud of an axe against wood. He was chopping his way in through the back wall. Each impact of the axe reverberated through the cabin like a death knell. I abandoned the fire attempt and searched desperately for an alternative escape route. The cabin had no other doors, and the windows were too small to climb through quickly, especially with my injured ankle. My gaze fell on the floor, rough-hewn planks with visible gaps between them. Dropping to my knees, I examined the construction more closely and found what I'd hoped for: a trapdoor leading to a small storage space beneath the cabin. With strength born of pure terror, I managed to pry it open just as the first boards at the back wall splintered inward. I lowered myself into the dirt-floored crawlspace and pulled the trapdoor closed above me. The space was barely 18 inches high, forcing me to lie flat on my stomach in the damp earth. Through gaps in the floorboards, I could see Russell finally break through the wall, axe in hand, his clothing torn and muddy from his efforts. Comet slipped in behind him, nostrils flaring as he caught my scent. Come out," Russell called, moving methodically through the one-room cabin, checking behind the sparse furniture. "The longer you hide, the worse it'll be." The dog moved differently, circling the cabin with purpose, nose to the ground. It stopped directly above me, scratching at the floorboards and whining. Russell laughed, a sound devoid of humor or humanity. "Good boy, Comet, found her." Footsteps approached the trapdoor. I pressed myself against the cold earth, searching for any means of defense in the darkness. My fingers closed around something long and metallic, a tire iron perhaps left by the cabin owners during construction. When the trapdoor lifted, I was ready. I swung the tire iron with all my remaining strength, connecting solidly with Russell's face as he peered into my hiding place. There was a sickening crunch and a spray of warm liquid across my hand. Russell fell backward, momentarily stunned. I scrambled from the crawl space, still clutching my makeshift weapon. Russell lay on his back, blood pouring from his shattered nose, the axe just beyond his outstretched fingers. I brought the tire iron down again, aiming for his temple, but he rolled aside with surprising agility. Comet lunged for me, but I managed to strike the dog across the muzzle, sending it yelping into the corner. Russell was on his feet now, blood streaming down his face and fire in his eyes. "You're just like the others," he spat through crimson teeth. "They all fight at the end. Makes it sweeter." He feinted toward the axe, and when I moved to block him, changed direction and tackled me bodily. We crashed to the floor, his weight driving the air from my lungs. His hands closed around my throat, thumbs pressing into my windpipe with practiced precision. Darkness began to cloud the edges of my vision as my oxygen depleted. In desperation, I drove my knee upward, connecting with his groin. His grip loosened fractionally, enough for me to twist sideways and break his hold. I crawled toward the axe, fingers closing around its wooden handle just as Russell grabbed my injured ankle. Pain exploded up my leg as he wrenched it savagely. I rolled onto my back, swinging the axe in a wild arc. The blade bit into his forearm, slicing through fabric and flesh. Russell released me, howling and clutching his wounded arm. Blood pulsed between his fingers, suggesting I'd hit an artery. His face registered shock. Perhaps he'd never encountered prey that fought back so effectively. But wounded animals are often the most dangerous. He reached behind his back and produced a hunting knife, its blade catching the faint light filtering through the broken wall. "Should have done this from the start," he growled, advancing on me again. We circled each other in the confined space of the cabin, each searching for an opening. Russell's injured arm hung uselessly at his side, but the knife in his right hand more than compensated for the disadvantage. My ankle threatened to collapse with each step, and exhaustion dulled my reactions. Outside, the storm had begun to abate, the thunder now distant rumbles rather than earth-shaking crashes. Through the broken wall, I caught glimpses of the sky lightening imperceptibly toward dawn. "Sun's coming up," Russell observed, following my gaze. "Been at this all night?" "Longest hunt I've had in years." "How many?" I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it. "How many people have you killed?" He smiled, revealing teeth stained with his own blood. "Enough to know exactly how this ends." He lunged suddenly, knife slashing toward my abdomen. I parried with the axe handle but lost my balance on my injured ankle. We both went down, Russell landing partially on top of me, his knife inches from my face as I held his wrist with both hands. Comet had recovered and now circled us, waiting for an opportunity to rejoin the fight. The dog's presence eliminated any chance of escape through the cabin's new rear entrance. Russell's face was inches from mine, his breath hot and metallic with blood. "Military taught me 16 ways to kill with just my hands," he whispered. "But I prefer the knife. More intimate." As we struggled, I became aware of a new sound cutting through the diminishing rain. An engine, distant but approaching. Russell heard it too, his head turning slightly toward the noise. I seized the moment of distraction to drive my forehead into his already broken nose. He reeled back, momentarily blinded by pain, and I scrambled from beneath him. The knife caught my calf as I moved, opening a shallow but painful gash. The engine sound grew louder, a vehicle on what must be a nearby service road. I stumbled to the cabin's front door, tore aside the table barricade, and threw myself onto the porch. "Help!" I screamed, my voice raw and unfamiliar. "Help me!" The forest had lightened enough to reveal shapes and contours. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of movement. A jeep with official markings picking its way along a rough track I hadn't known existed. Park rangers conducting post-storm checks of the backcountry. Russell appeared in the doorway behind me, knife still in hand. For one terrible moment, I thought he would kill me regardless of the approaching vehicle. But self-preservation won out. He retreated into the cabin's shadows. I half ran, half fell down the cabin steps and toward the approaching jeep, waving my arms frantically. The vehicle stopped, and two uniformed rangers emerged. their expressions transitioning from surprise to alarm as they took in my battered state. "He's in there," I gasped, pointing toward the cabin. "He tried to kill me. Others too. He has a knife." The Rangers exchanged glances, one speaking rapidly into a radio, while the other drew his sidearm and positioned himself between me and the cabin. What followed seemed dreamlike in its surreality. More vehicles arriving, men and women in various uniforms securing the area. Someone wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and led me to a medical vehicle, where my injuries were assessed and treated with efficiency that bordered on tenderness. Russell Jenkins didn't emerge from the cabin until surrounded by armed officers. Even then, he maintained the facade of innocence, claiming he'd been trying to help a lost, confused hiker who had attacked him without provocation. But the cabin told a different story. Beneath a loose floorboard, investigators found his true legacy: driver's licenses, credit cards, jewelry, and personal effects belonging to hikers reported missing over the past decade. Photos matching those circled on the walls, a journal detailing his hunts in meticulous, disturbing detail. I learned later that Russell Jenkins wasn't even his real name. He had been Walter Gregory Simmons, a former military specialist with a history of psychiatric hospitalizations dating back to his discharge. The cabin belonged to a family whose son had been among his first victims, a cruel irony that he had used their own property as a hunting blind for subsequent targets. The mountains still call to me sometimes, their siren song unchanged by the horrors I experienced among them, but I haven't returned to the trails. Instead, I watch them from a distance, their ancient ridges eternally indifferent to the darkness that sometimes walks beneath their canopy. The darkness that lives not in the forest itself, but in the hearts of those who use its wild isolation to become the monsters they truly are. I know now that the most terrifying predators wear human faces and speak with gentle voices. They ask your name on mountain trails and offer assistance when you're lost. They have practiced smiles that never reach their eyes, and they hunt among us still. In the summer of 2019, when I was 26, I found myself working as a lifeguard at Pinecrest Resort, nestled deep in the Adirondack Mountains. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough. And the location, a sprawling property surrounded by dense forest and pristine lakes, made up for the monotony of watching swimmers all day. Pinecrest wasn't exactly a tourist hotspot, but it maintained a steady stream of visitors throughout the summer months. Most were city folks looking to escape the suffocating heat and noise of urban life, eager to hike the numerous trails and soak in the natural tranquility that pervaded the mountain area. The resort itself was spread across several acres, featuring a main 3-story hotel, about 20 cabins scattered throughout the property, and various amenities including tennis courts, hiking trails, and the swimming pool that was my domain. Most days passed without incident. I'd sit in my elevated chair, scanning the water, occasionally blowing my whistle at someone running on the wet concrete or diving in the shallow end. The pool wasn't particularly large, about 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, but it was well maintained and surrounded by lounge chairs that were usually occupied by sunbathers more interested in tanning than swimming. What struck me most about the place was how the atmosphere changed as evening approached. The mountains cast long shadows across the property early, and the temperature would drop rapidly once the sun began to set. The forest that surrounded the resort seemed to grow denser, darker as if closing in around us. During my evening walks back to the staff quarters, I often felt uneasy, as though the trees were watching me pass. I dismissed these feelings as the product of too many horror movies, but I couldn't shake them completely. The resort manager, a stern woman named Judith, had warned all staff about the dangers of the surrounding wilderness during orientation. "We've had bears, coyotes, and even the occasional mountain lion spotted in these woods," she'd said. "Never wander off the marked trails, especially after dark." At the time, I'd nodded along, not thinking much of it. The real danger, as I would soon discover, wasn't from the wildlife. Staff turnover at Pinecrest was high. Seasonal workers came and went frequently. I rarely bothered learning names unless I worked directly with someone. This casual attitude toward my colleagues would later prove to be a critical mistake. It happened on a particularly hot day in late July. The sun hung high overhead, beating down mercilessly on the pool deck. I was on lifeguard duty, my skin sticky with sweat and sunscreen despite the shade of my umbrella. The pool area was moderately busy that afternoon. A mix of families with children, older couples lounging with books, and a group of young women celebrating what appeared to be a bachelorette party. The women, all in their mid-20s, were gathered around the shallow end, sipping colorful drinks and laughing. My attention was drawn to the fence that separated the pool area from the rest of the resort. A man was standing there just watching. He appeared to be in his 30s with dark hair cut short against his scalp and wearing swim trunks, as if he intended to use the pool. But he made no move to enter through the gate. Instead, he just stood there staring at the group of women. At first, I didn't think much of it. People often lingered outside the pool area, checking how crowded it was before deciding to enter. But as minutes passed and he remained motionless, I began to feel uncomfortable. His gaze was fixed exclusively on the bachelorette party, his expression blank and unreadable from my vantage point. After about 10 minutes, he approached the fence near where the women were gathered and began speaking to them. I couldn't hear what he was saying over the ambient noise of splashing water and conversations, but I could see the women's reactions. They shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, their bodies turning away from him in that universal signal of disinterest. One woman with auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail glanced toward me with an expression that clearly communicated discomfort. I decided to intervene. Climbing down from my chair, I approached the edge of the pool nearest to where the man stood. "Excuse me," I called out, keeping my voice casual but firm. "Do you have a pool key? This area is for resort guests only." He turned slowly to face me, and I felt an immediate jolt of apprehension. His eyes were unsettlingly vacant, as if there was nothing behind them. No emotion, no thought, just empty observation. For a moment I thought he might argue or become confrontational, but instead his lips curled into what might generously be called a smile. "Not yet," he replied, his voice oddly flat. Then he shrugged, mumbled something inaudible, and walked away, his gait stiff and mechanical. The women visibly relaxed once he disappeared from view. One of them, a brunette with a warm smile, waved me over to their group. "Thank you for that," she said sincerely. He was really starting to freak us out. I tried to appear confident and professional. "No problem at all. Just doing my job." She introduced herself as Amanda and pointed out her friends, Jenna, Kelly, Katie, and Ivy. They were celebrating Ivy's upcoming wedding with a weekend getaway at Pinecrest. We chatted briefly about the resort and their stay so far, and as our conversation wound down, Amanda surprised me with an invitation. "We're having a small get-together at our cabin tonight," she said. "Cabin 7 just down by the lake. You should stop by if you're free. Around 8? Being single and with no real plans for the evening beyond watching television in the staff lounge, I accepted the invitation, trying not to appear too eager. As sunset approached, I finished my shift and headed back to the staff quarters to shower and change. The evening air had cooled considerably, and the sky was painted in deep purples and oranges as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Walking through the property toward Cabin 7, I couldn't help but notice how quiet everything had become. The daytime sounds of children playing and people chatting had given way to an eerie stillness, broken only by the distant hooting of an owl and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Cabin 7 was one of the more secluded accommodations, situated near the edge of the property with its back facing the woods. A small porch wrapped around the front, decorated with string lights that cast a warm glow against the growing darkness. I knocked on the door, feeling oddly nervous as if I were crossing some professional boundary by socializing with guests. Amanda opened the door, greeting me with a smile. "You made it. Come on in." The interior of the cabin was cozy and warm. The main room served as both living area and kitchen, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. The women had set up drinks and snacks on the kitchen counter, and soft music played from a portable speaker. The atmosphere was relaxed and welcoming. "We weren't sure you'd actually come," Jenna said, handing me a beer. "Don't you have, resort staff rules about hanging out with guests?" I shrugged. "Probably, but what Judith doesn't know won't hurt her." The evening progressed pleasantly. We talked, laughed, and shared stories. I learned that the women had been friends since college and tried to take a trip together each year. I told them about my life, how I'd taken the lifeguard job as a temporary position while figuring out my next move after graduating with a degree in environmental science. As the night deepened and more drinks were consumed, the conversation turned to the resort itself and the surrounding area. "Have you heard any ghost stories about this place?" Kelly asked, her eyes gleaming mischievously in the dim light. "It seems like the perfect setting for something creepy." I shook my head. "No official ghost stories that I know of, but the woods can get pretty intense at night. Some of the hiking guides refuse to lead twilight tours anymore." "Why's that?" Ivy asked, leaning forward with interest. "They claim they've heard strange noises out there after dark. Not animal sounds, more like, I don't know, movement. Deliberate movement." I wasn't trying to scare them, just repeating what I'd heard in the staff lounge. A brief silence fell over the room, broken when Katie suggested, "We should go for a night hike." My stomach tightened at the idea. "I don't think that's a good—" "Oh, come on," Jenna interrupted. "We have flashlights and we'll stay on the trails. What's the worst that could happen?" Looking back, I wish I'd been more insistent, that I had made up some resort policy forbidding night hiking. But caught up in the moment and not wanting to seem cowardly, I reluctantly agreed. "Fine, but we stick to the main trail that loops around the property. No venturing deeper into the woods." They eagerly agreed, and after gathering flashlights and jackets, our group set out into the darkness. The night air was cool against my skin as we stepped outside. The moon hung high overhead, nearly full, casting a silver glow that did little to penetrate the dense canopy of trees surrounding the property. We followed the gravel path leading from the cabin toward the main hiking trail, our flashlights creating dancing beams of light that seemed to bounce off the darkness rather than cut through it. "Stay close," I advised, taking the lead. "The trail is well marked, but it's easy to stray off if you're not paying attention." The main trail was a 2-mile loop that circled the perimeter of the resort property. During the day, it offered scenic views of the surrounding mountains and valley. At night, it transformed into a tunnel of darkness, the trees on either side forming a claustrophobic corridor that seemed to swallow our light. As we walked, the usual nighttime forest sounds surrounded us, crickets chirping, the occasional rustling of leaves as small nocturnal creatures moved about, the distant hooting of owls. The women chatted quietly among themselves, their voices hushed as if they feared disturbing the forest. About a half-mile into our hike, I began to notice something unusual. The natural sounds of the forest seemed to diminish, growing fainter until they stopped altogether. The sudden silence was jarring, like walking into a vacuum. I slowed my pace, senses heightened. "Does anyone else notice how quiet it's gotten?" Amanda whispered from behind me. So it wasn't just my imagination. The others stopped, and we all stood still, listening to the unnatural silence. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the trail. It wasn't the random rustling of wildlife. It was deliberate, methodical. Footsteps. "Is someone there?" Katie called out, her voice cracking slightly. No response came from the darkness, but the footsteps stopped. We waited, frozen in place, straining to hear anything beyond our own breathing. Just as I was about to suggest we continue moving, the sound resumed, faster now, circling around us, moving parallel to the trail but keeping within the cover of the trees. "We need to go back," I said firmly, turning to face the group. Their expressions ranged from confused to frightened, illuminated in the harsh glow of the flashlights. "It's probably just a deer," Jenna suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. Then Amanda gasped, pointing her flashlight toward a gap in the trees. "I saw something. Someone." We all turned to look, our beams converging on the spot, but whatever Amanda had seen was gone. The footsteps had stopped again, leaving us in that oppressive silence. "I don't like this," Ivy whispered. "Let's go back to the cabin." No one argued. We turned and began walking quickly back the way we had come, our earlier relaxed pace replaced by urgent strides. I took up the rear position, constantly glancing behind us, unable to shake the feeling that we were being followed. We were about halfway back to the resort when I heard it again. Footsteps. Much closer now. No longer keeping to the trees but on the trail behind us. I turned, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and for a split second I thought I saw a figure duck behind a tree. "Run," I said, my voice low but intense. "Back to the cabin now." We broke into a sprint, fear propelling us forward. The gravel crunched loudly beneath our feet. our breathing heavy and panicked. I continued to check behind us as we ran, and each time, I was certain the distance between us and whoever was following had decreased. We burst through the cabin door, piling inside before slamming it shut and engaging the lock. Our breathing came in ragged gasps as we stood in the living room, staring at each other with wide, frightened eyes. "What the hell was that?" Kelly demanded, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I admitted, moving to the window to peer out into the darkness. The porch light illuminated a small area in front of the cabin, but beyond that was impenetrable blackness. "But I'm pretty sure someone was following us." "Should we call security?" Ivy asked, already reaching for her phone. I hesitated. What exactly would we report? That we heard footsteps in the woods? That we thought someone might have been following us? It sounded ridiculous even in my own mind. "Let's just calm down for a minute," I suggested, though my heart was still racing. It could have been another hiker or maybe one of the night staff checking the trails. Amanda shook her head firmly. "No way. Did you see how they were hiding? Normal people don't hide when you shine a light on them." She had a point. I moved away from the window and suggested we lock all the doors and windows just to be safe. As we moved through the cabin securing it, Katie turned the music back on, louder than before, as if to drown out the fear that had followed us home. We gathered in the living room, trying to laugh off our fear, telling ourselves we had overreacted. The drinks helped, and gradually the tension began to ease. But just as we were starting to relax, a sound from outside caught my attention. Soft footsteps on the porch. I held up my hand, signaling for silence. The others froze, eyes darting to the windows and door. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Each creak of the wooden board sent a fresh wave of fear through me. "Turn off the lights," I whispered. Jenna quickly moved to the switches, plunging the cabin into darkness. We sat in silence, listening as the footsteps completed a circuit around the cabin before stopping at the back door. The handle jiggled slightly, testing if it was locked. "Oh my God," Katie breathed, barely audible. "Did anyone lock the back door?" Amanda whispered urgently. A moment of terrible uncertainty passed before I remembered checking it myself. Yes, I did. "All the doors are locked." The handle stopped moving, and for a moment there was silence. Then slowly we heard the footsteps retreat from the back door and continue around to the side of the cabin, where a window looked into the kitchen. I crept across the floor, staying low until I reached the kitchen window. Carefully I peered out, trying to see if anyone was there. At first I saw nothing, just darkness. Then a face appeared at the window so suddenly that I fell backward in shock. It was him, the man from the pool. He pressed his face against the glass, those empty eyes scanning the interior of the cabin. I scrambled away from the window, back into the living room. "It's him," I hissed. "The guy from the pool. Are you sure?" Amanda asked, her voice trembling. "Positive. We need to call security now." Ivy already had her phone out, dialing the resort's emergency number. As she spoke quietly into the phone, explaining our situation, the footsteps resumed, moving back toward the front of the cabin. Then suddenly they stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the footsteps. We waited, tense and afraid, for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, there was a loud crash from the front of the cabin, the sound of something heavy hitting the door. "What was that?" Jenna gasped, clutching Katie's arm. "He's trying to break in," I said, my mind racing for a solution. "Security's at least 10 minutes away. We need to barricade the door." We moved quickly, pushing the heavy coffee table against the front door, followed by whatever else we could find. Chairs, end tables, even the small bookshelf from the corner. The door rattled again as someone slammed against it, but our makeshift barricade held. "We need a weapon," Amanda said, her earlier fear giving way to determination. She disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with the largest knife from the drawer. I looked around the cabin for anything I could use to defend us. On the wall near the fireplace hung a set of fire tools. I grabbed the poker, its weight reassuring in my hand. The pounding at the door stopped, replaced once again by footsteps circling the cabin. We huddled together in the center of the living room, weapons raised, waiting. "He's looking for another way in," I whispered. "All the doors and windows are locked, right?" The women nodded, but uncertainty flickered across their faces. None of us could be completely sure. We should split up and check again, Kelly suggested. 2 of us can check the front rooms, 2 the back. I shook my head firmly. No, that's exactly what we shouldn't do. We stay together. But what if we missed something? She insisted. If there's an unlocked window somewhere, he'll find it. I agree with him, Amanda said. We stay together. But Ivy and Kelly weren't convinced. Look, security's on their way, right? We just need to make sure all entry points are secure until they get here. It'll be faster if we split up. Before I could argue further, another crash came from the back of the cabin, the sound of glass breaking. Someone had smashed a window. He's coming in, Katie cried, her voice rising in panic. In the chaos that followed, our unity fractured. Ivy and Kelly broke away, rushing toward the back of the cabin to check the source of the noise. Amanda, Jenna, and I remained in the living room, weapons raised facing the hall that led to the rear bedrooms. Ivy! Kelly, get back here! I called, but there was no response. Seconds stretched into minutes as we waited, the silence broken only by our rapid breathing. Then we heard it, a scream from the back bedroom cut short almost immediately. We have to help them, Jenna said, moving toward the hallway. I grabbed her arm, holding her back. Wait, we don't know what's happening. They're our friends, she hissed, pulling away from me. Before we could decide what to do, footsteps pounded down the hallway toward us. Not the measured, deliberate steps from before, but frantic, running footsteps. Ivy burst into the living room, her face pale with terror. He's got Kelly, she gasped. He came through the bathroom window. We tried to run, but he grabbed her. I couldn't help her. A violent thud from the hallway silenced her. We turned to see Kelly staggering into the living room, blood streaming from a cut on her forehead. Behind her, filling the hallway with his presence, stood the man from the pool. In the dim light, I could see now what I hadn't noticed before, the intensity in his eyes, the barely contained rage that seemed to radiate from him. He held a shard of glass in his hand, the edge stained with Kelly's blood. Run, I said, pushing the women toward the front door. Get the barricade down and run. I'll hold him off. Amanda and Jenna rushed to dismantle our barricade while Ivy helped the injured Kelly toward the door. I stood between them and the intruder, fire poker raised defensively. Stay back, I warned, my voice steadier than I felt. He said nothing, merely tilted his head slightly, studying me with those empty eyes. Then without warning, he lunged forward. I swung the poker, connecting with his shoulder. He grunted in pain but didn't slow, barreling into me with surprising force. We crashed to the floor, the poker flying from my grip and skittering across the hardwood. He was strong, far stronger than I'd anticipated. His hands found my throat, pressing down with crushing pressure. I clawed at his wrists, trying to break his grip, but black spots were already dancing at the edges of my vision. Behind him, I could see Amanda hesitating at the open door, the others already outside. She looked from me to the door, conflict clear on her face. Go! I tried to shout, but no sound emerged from my constricted throat. Instead of fleeing, Amanda darted to the side of the room, grabbing something I couldn't see. The man continued to press down on my throat, his face expressionless save for a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. Something almost like satisfaction. Just as consciousness began to slip away, there was a whistling sound through the air, followed by a sickening crack. The pressure on my throat vanished abruptly as the man collapsed on top of me, suddenly limp. Gasping for air, I pushed his unconscious body aside to see Amanda standing over us, a golf club gripped in her trembling hands. Her face was ashen, but her jaw was set with determination. Did I kill him? She whispered. I checked for a pulse, finding it steady despite the blow to his head. No, just knocked out. We need to restrain him before he wakes up. Using cords from the curtains and lamps, we bound his hands and feet. By this time, Jenna had returned with Ivy, who reported that they'd flagged down a security vehicle on the road. Kelly was with them, receiving first aid. Within minutes, the cabin was swarming with resort security, and shortly after, local police. The man, still unconscious, was handcuffed and loaded into a police cruiser. We gave our statements describing the events of the evening in shaking voices. The following day, I was called to Judith's office. She looked more severe than usual, her mouth a tight line of disapproval. I've just gotten off the phone with the police. she said without preamble. "The man who attacked you and those guests last night was Warren Reed. He was hired as a maintenance worker 3 days ago." I sat heavily in the chair across from her desk, the implications sinking in. "He worked here? Did anyone vet him?" "Of course we did," she snapped. "His references checked out. His background check came back clean. There was nothing to indicate." She trailed off, running a hand through her graying hair. "The police searched his apartment in town. They found concerning items." "What kind of items?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "Photographs of female guests, taken through windows from the woods. Maps of the property with certain cabins circled. Cabin 7 was among them." She paused, letting the horror of what might have happened settle between us. He had been watching them, watching many of our female guests, for days. Planning. I thought of the empty look in his eyes, the methodical way he had stalked us through the woods, the calculated attacks. A deep shudder ran through me. "The police believe he may be connected to similar incidents at other resorts in the region," Judith continued. "They're investigating further." That evening, I visited Amanda and her friends in their new accommodations, a suite in the main hotel, as far from the woods as possible. They were leaving the next morning, their vacation irreparably tainted by terror. "The police officer said you saved our lives," Kelly told me. The bandage on her forehead a stark reminder of how close we'd come to tragedy. "I think it was Amanda who saved us all," I corrected, glancing at the brunette. She gave a modest shrug, but there was a new strength in her posture. "God was watching over us," Ivy murmured. "It could have been so much worse." As I walked back to the staff quarters that night, the forest loomed around me, darker and more threatening than ever before. I kept imagining eyes watching from between the trees, though rationally I knew Warren was in police custody, unable to harm anyone else. The resort implemented new security measures after the incident, better lighting on the trails, more frequent security patrols, stricter vetting for employees. But these changes did little to ease the sense of vulnerability that had taken root in me. I finished out the summer season, but I never again felt comfortable at Pinecrest. The wilderness that had once seemed beautiful now felt malevolent, hiding dangers more terrifying than any bear or mountain lion. The most frightening monsters, I had learned, were the human ones, the ones that walked among us, worked alongside us, watched us with empty eyes while planning unimaginable horrors. Sometimes, even now years later, I wake in the night thinking I hear footsteps circling my house. I lie awake listening to the darkness, remembering those hours in Cabin 7 when I came face to face with true evil. Not supernatural, not mythical, but human. And somehow that makes it all the more terrifying. I was in 7th grade when our science teacher, Mr. Westfield, announced we'd be taking a field trip to the mountains to study birds. We'd been immersed in a unit on ecology, and he thought experiencing wildlife firsthand would be more educational than simply studying textbooks. At 13, I wasn't particularly enthusiastic about the outdoors. My weekends typically involved video games and science fiction novels, not hiking through dense forests identifying wildlife. "This will be an excellent opportunity for all of you," Mr. Westfield explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "You'll observe birds in their natural habitat, learn to identify species by their markings and calls, and understand ecological relationships in a way that's impossible from a classroom." He distributed permission slips, explaining that we would spend a full day at Ridgeline Mountain State Park, approximately an hour's drive from our school. Each student would need to identify at least 10 different bird species, recording observations about appearance, behavior, and vocalizations. "Can we see eagles?" asked a girl sitting near the front. "Possibly," Mr. Westfield replied. "The park has recorded sightings of golden eagles, though they're rare. You're more likely to spot hawks, vultures, and various songbirds." Despite my indoor tendencies, I felt a slight flutter of anticipation. Part of me wondered what secrets those mountains might hold. I had never been on a proper wilderness hike before, and the prospect of seeing predatory birds in flight held a certain appeal. That evening, I handed the permission slip to my mother, who signed it immediately. "This will be good for you," she said. "You spend too much time with those video games. A day in the fresh air will do wonders." I shrugged noncommittally but secretly agreed. Perhaps this field trip would offer something different from my usual routine. As I prepared for bed that night, I imagined soaring hawks and the vastness of the mountain landscape. I had no idea what horrors awaited in those seemingly peaceful woods. The morning of the field trip arrived with perfect weather, crisp spring air with gentle sunshine filtering through scattered clouds. I packed my backpack meticulously. Water bottle, lunch, snacks, the required notebook and pencils, and a small pair of binoculars my father had loaned me. He'd seemed pleased by my interest in wildlife observation, however reluctant it might be. "These were my father's," he'd said, handing me the vintage binoculars. "Take good care of them." The weight of them in my bag felt significant, like a responsibility I hadn't anticipated. At school, students gathered in the parking lot, buzzing with excitement. The yellow bus waited with its engine idling, exhaust fumes rising in the morning air. I spotted my two friends, Ryan and Drew, standing near the back of the crowd. We had been inseparable since elementary school, living on the same street and sharing similar interests in science fiction and computer games. "Ready for this nature adventure?" Drew asked, adjusting his baseball cap. He was the most athletic of our trio, always ready for physical challenges. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, trying to sound indifferent even as nervousness fluttered in my stomach. Ryan flipped through a pamphlet Mr. Westfield had distributed the previous day. "Look at all these birds we might see. Red-tailed hawks, woodpeckers, warblers." "I just hope we see something worth writing about," I said. "I don't want to come back with an empty notebook." We boarded the bus, claiming seats toward the middle. As we settled in, Mr. Westfield stood at the front, counting heads and checking his clipboard. Two parent volunteers sat in the front row, their expressions betraying mild apprehension at the prospect of shepherding 24 seventh graders through mountain trails. The bus lurched forward, and we were on our way. The journey took us through familiar suburbs that gradually gave way to rural landscapes. Houses became more scattered, replaced by expanses of farmland and eventually the rising foothills of the mountain range. The roads narrowed and began to wind, following the natural contours of the land. As we climbed higher, the vegetation changed. Dense forests of oak, maple, and pine covered the slopes. The morning sun now fully emerged from behind the clouds, casting dappled shadows through the canopy as we drove beneath overhanging branches. "Did you know this mountain range has some of the oldest forests in the region?" Ryan commented, still absorbed in his reading materials. "Some of these trees could be hundreds of years old." "Great," Drew replied with a smirk. "Ancient trees. Very exciting." I gazed out the window, watching the forest thicken. Something about the density of those woods made me uneasy. The trees stood so close together that beyond the first few rows, all visibility disappeared into shadowy darkness. Despite the bright spring day, the forest depths remained impenetrably dark. "We're almost there," Mr. Westfield announced from the front of the bus. "When we arrive, stay together until you receive your group assignments and trail maps." The bus rounded a final curve and entered a small gravel parking lot adjacent to a wooden ranger station. A large sign welcomed visitors to Ridgeline Mountain State Park, featuring carved images of local wildlife. We had arrived at our destination, unaware that for some of us, this place would forever remain in our nightmares. The parking lot buzzed with activity as students disembarked, stretching legs and adjusting backpacks. A park ranger greeted Mr. Westfield, reviewing trail maps and safety guidelines. The ranger, a weathered man with sun-creased skin and an official-looking uniform, addressed our class with practiced efficiency. "Welcome to Ridgeline Mountain," he began. "We have over 30 miles of trails here, but today you'll be exploring the main loop trail, which is approximately 3 miles long and well-marked throughout. Remember to stay on designated paths at all times, maintain your group formations, and be respectful of wildlife." He continued with standard warnings about not feeding animals, proper disposal of trash, and emergency procedures. Then he mentioned something that caught my attention. This time of year, we occasionally see black bears emerging from hibernation. They're generally not aggressive, but if you encounter one, back away slowly and make noise to alert the rest of your group. Under no circumstances should you run or approach the animal. A murmur rippled through the group. The prospect of encountering a bear added an unexpected element of danger to our bird-watching expedition. Mr. Westfield divided us into groups of 3, assigning each group a section of the trail and a specific time frame for return to the parking lot. By some stroke of luck, I was grouped with Ryan and Drew, maintaining our usual trio. We received a trail map marked with our designated route, the eastern section of the main loop, which would take us around the base of the mountain rather than up steep inclines. Remember, Mr. Westfield emphasized, your assignment is to identify at least 10 different bird species. Note their coloration, behavior, and habitat. We'll be checking your observations against field guides when we return to school. With our notebooks and water bottles ready, we set off on the trail. The beginning was wide and well-maintained, with a layer of wood chips covering the path. Informational signs appeared at regular intervals, describing local flora and fauna. Initially, our progress was slow as we stopped frequently to observe robins, chickadees, and other common birds. Ryan meticulously recorded each sighting, while Drew scanned the canopy with his own binoculars. I felt myself relaxing into the experience, finding unexpected pleasure in this methodical observation of nature. The woods grew denser as we moved deeper along the trail. Massive tree trunks rose on either side, their canopies creating a partial ceiling that allowed only occasional shafts of sunlight to penetrate. The temperature dropped noticeably in these shadowy sections, and sounds seemed muted, as if the forest absorbed them. "It's so quiet here," I remarked, noticing how our voices felt intrusive in the stillness. "That's because we're making too much noise," Drew replied. "If we want to see more interesting birds, we need to be quieter." We continued in relative silence, stopping occasionally to listen for bird calls. The forest seemed to press in around us, the trees forming walls that limited our view to just a few yards in any direction. Despite the clear trail markers, I felt increasingly disoriented, losing track of how far we had traveled from the parking lot. After about 40 minutes of hiking, we reached a small clearing where the trail widened. A massive oak tree stood at the center, its trunk gnarled and imposing, its branches extending like arthritic fingers against the sky. The tree commanded attention, dwarfing everything around it. "That has to be the biggest tree I've seen all day," Drew whispered, tilting his head back to take in its full height. "It's ancient," Ryan agreed, approaching the trunk. "Look at how thick and twisted it is. This thing has probably been here for centuries." I ran my hand along the deeply furrowed bark, feeling its rough texture. "We might have a better chance of spotting birds from here. The clearing gives us a wider view of the canopy." We decided to rest beneath the great oak, settling ourselves among its sprawling surface roots. I leaned back against the trunk, feeling the solid presence of the tree supporting me. Above, the branches formed an intricate lattice against the blue sky. It seemed like the perfect observation point. None of us could have imagined what waited in those ancient branches, invisible yet watching our every move. Beneath the oak, we unpacked our lunches and ate while scanning the surrounding trees for movement. The forest seemed to have relaxed around us, bird calls resuming as the creatures grew accustomed to our presence. A woodpecker hammered rhythmically in the distance, its percussion echoing through the woods. 7 species so far, Ryan noted, reviewing his list. "We need 3 more to complete the assignment." "I'm hoping to see something more impressive than sparrows and finches," Drew said, raising his binoculars to scan the treetops. "Maybe a hawk or an owl." "Owls are nocturnal," I pointed out. "We're unlikely to see one active during daylight." The afternoon sunlight filtered through the oak's canopy, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. The air held a peculiar stillness, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. I noticed that the bird calls had once again diminished, leaving an unnatural quiet surrounding our small group. "It's weird how the birds keep going silent," I said, closing my notebook. "Almost like something's scaring them." Drew shrugged. "Probably just us moving around too much." I wasn't convinced. The silence felt deliberate, weighted with anticipation. I found myself scanning the underbrush more frequently, expecting to glimpse movement among the shadows. The massive oak above us creaked occasionally, its ancient wood adjusting to subtle shifts in the breeze. "Hey, what's that?" Ryan suddenly whispered, pointing upward. Following his gesture, I peered into the dense foliage overhead. At first I saw nothing unusual, just leaves and branches. Then my eyes settled on a dark mass nestled in the crook of a large branch, perhaps 30 feet above us. The shape seemed incongruous with the surrounding vegetation, too symmetrical to be random growth. "What are you looking at?" Drew asked, raising his binoculars. "That dark thing up there," Ryan replied. "See it where the big branch forks?" Drew adjusted his focus. "Yeah, I see it. Some kind of nest, maybe?" I squinted, wishing I had brought my binoculars out of my backpack. The mass appeared roughly the size of a beach ball, with an irregular texture that didn't match the smooth bark of the oak. It remained perfectly still despite the gentle breeze that stirred the surrounding leaves. "If it's a nest, it's huge," I observed, "and I don't see any birds around it." "Could be abandoned," Ryan suggested, though he sounded uncertain. As we continued to stare, I felt an inexplicable sense of dread building in my chest. Something about that motionless shape triggered a primal warning system in my brain. I wanted to suggest moving to another spot, but I hesitated, not wanting my friends to think I was being irrational. Then we heard it, a strange vocalization unlike any bird call I'd encountered. It began as a low, rasping hiss that transformed into a high-pitched chirp before fading back to silence. The sound seemed to emanate directly from the dark mass. "What was that?" Drew whispered, lowering his binoculars. His face had paled noticeably. "I don't know," Ryan replied, his voice tight. "Not like any bird I've heard before." "Maybe we should move on," I suggested, unable to mask the anxiety in my voice. Before either could respond, we heard a rustle of wings. A large bird with a dark body and distinctive red head glided into view, settling on a branch not far from the mysterious shape. Even without binoculars, I recognized it immediately. "Turkey vulture," Ryan whispered excitedly, making a note in his book. "That's species number 8. The vulture adjusted its position, folding its impressive wings against its body. It seemed unaware of our presence below, its attention focused elsewhere. I noticed it hadn't acknowledged the dark mass either, despite perching relatively close to it. "They feed on carrion," Drew commented. "I wonder if it smells something dead nearby." I was about to respond when I noticed movement. The dark mass shifted almost imperceptibly at first, then with shocking speed. Before any of us could react, it launched itself toward the vulture. What happened next would haunt me for years to come. The dark shape struck with terrifying precision, covering the distance to the vulture in less than a second. As it moved, its form expanded, revealing multiple appendages that reached out to ensnare the bird. The vulture barely had time to spread its wings before it was seized and immobilized. A sound pierced the forest, a horrifying blend of the vulture's panicked squawk and something else, something utterly inhuman. A wet, guttural hissing emanated from the attacker as it secured its grip on the struggling bird. "What is that thing?" Ryan screamed, scrambling backward. In the dappled light, I caught glimpses of the creature that defied comprehension. It appeared to be an arachnid of impossible size, its body covered in dense dark fur, 8 jointed legs, each as thick as my wrist, wrapped around the vulture and the branch. At the front of its bulbous body, I glimpsed mandibles working rapidly as they penetrated the bird's flesh. Drew had fallen backward, his binoculars dropping to the ground. "Oh God," he choked out. "Oh God, what is that?" The creature pulled the vulture closer to its mouthparts. I watched in horror as it began to feed, puncturing the bird's body with its fangs. Dark fluid dripped from the vulture's wounds, spattering on the leaves below. The slurping, sucking sound that followed was worse than anything I could have imagined, the unmistakable noise of a predator extracting fluids from its prey. My stomach heaved. I scrambled to my feet, abandoning my notebook and water bottle. Ryan and Drew were already in motion, bolting toward the trail. Without a word, I followed, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force I thought it might burst. "Run!" Drew shouted unnecessarily. We were already sprinting at full speed, crashing through underbrush with no regard for the path or our footing. I glanced back once, terrified the creature might be pursuing us. Through the trees I could still see the massive oak, but the predator remained where we had left it, feasting on its kill. That single backward glance nearly cost me, as I stumbled over an exposed root and barely caught myself before falling. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. Eventually, we collided with another group from our class, 3 students and one of the parent chaperones, Mrs. Bennett. They stared at us in alarm as we skidded to a halt before them, gasping for breath and wide-eyed with panic. "What on earth?" Mrs. Bennet exclaimed, reaching out to steady Drew, who looked ready to collapse. What happened? Are you hurt? Words tumbled out between desperate gulps of air. Ryan tried to explain, gesturing wildly back toward the direction we had come. Giant spider. It attacked. A vulture. Eating it. The other students exchanged looks of disbelief, smirking at what they clearly assumed was an attempt to frighten them. Mrs. Bennet's expression shifted from concern to skepticism. A spider that attacked a vulture? She repeated. Boys, that's not possible. We saw it, I insisted, my voice cracking with emotion. It was huge like a dog, but a spider. It grabbed the vulture and I couldn't continue, the memory of those feeding sounds making me nauseous again. Drew nodded vigorously. It's true. We were sitting under this massive oak tree, and this thing was hiding in the branches. It moved so fast. Please, we have to get back to the bus. Mrs. Bennet looked uncertain, glancing between our terrified faces and the peaceful forest trail behind us. Where exactly did this happen? About half a mile back, Ryan said. There's a clearing with a huge oak tree. But we can't go back there. That thing could come after us. One of the other students laughed. Are you guys serious? There's no such thing as a giant spider. You're making this up. We're not, Drew snapped, his face flushed with anger and fear. We saw it. It was real. Mrs. Bennet made a decision. Let's head back toward the meeting point. I'll radio Mr. Westfield and let him know what's happening. She pulled out a small two-way radio and called our teacher. After a brief exchange during which I heard Mr. Westfield's voice crackle through with obvious confusion, she informed us that we would proceed to the ranger station to report what we had seen. As we walked, the other students kept their distance from us, whispering and occasionally laughing. I didn't care what they thought. The image of that creature was burned into my mind, its impossible size, the swift predatory movement, those glistening mandibles. No one who hadn't seen it could understand the horror we had witnessed. At the ranger station, we sat on wooden benches outside while Mr. Westfield and the park ranger interviewed us separately. The other groups had been instructed to continue their observations, but to stay on the main trails closer to the parking area. I could see them casting curious glances in our direction, undoubtedly wondering about the commotion we had caused. When my turn came to speak with the ranger, I entered the small office with trepidation. The man's weathered face remained impassive as I recounted what I had seen. His eyes narrowed slightly when I described the size of the creature, but he let me finish without interruption. Son, he said finally, leaning forward in his chair, I've worked in these mountains for 17 years. I know every species of wildlife in this park, and I can assure you there are no spiders that size anywhere in this region, or this country, for that matter. But we all saw it, I insisted, my voice trembling. It was real. It grabbed a turkey vulture right out of the air. The ranger sighed, scratching his jaw thoughtfully. What you boys probably saw was a hawk or eagle taking a smaller bird. From your angle below, and with the sunlight filtering through the trees, it could have created an optical illusion. Predator birds have powerful talons that could easily be mistaken for legs in the right circumstances. I shook my head vehemently. No, it wasn't a bird. It had 8 legs and fangs. It was covered in fur. The largest spider in this region is the wolf spider, and they're no bigger than your palm, he explained patiently. Is it possible that what you saw was actually a small predator, maybe a fisher or a pine marten attacking a bird? His calm rationality made me doubt myself momentarily. Could we have misinterpreted what we saw? The memory seemed so vivid, so horrifying. But was it possible that fear and imagination had distorted our perception? I know what I saw, I said, though with less conviction than before. The ranger nodded, not unkindly. Fear can play tricks on the mind, especially in unfamiliar surroundings. The human brain is wired to sometimes see threats where none exist. It's a survival mechanism from our ancestors. Mr. Westfield, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. Perhaps I should take a look at this tree. Where exactly was it located? I described the location as best I could, mentioning the clearing and the distinctive size of the oak. The ranger nodded in recognition. That would be the heritage oak. It's over 300 years old and a landmark in the park. I can lead you there if you'd like to investigate. My stomach clenched at the thought of returning to that spot. You can't go there. That thing could still be in the tree. The ranger stood checking his belt, which I noticed held a large canister of bear spray and a radio. I'll go have a look. If there's any unusual wildlife in the area, I should document it. Despite my protests, they decided to investigate. The ranger, Mr. Westfield, and the male parent volunteer set off down the trail, leaving Mrs. Bennett to supervise the remaining students at the ranger station. Ryan, Drew, and I huddled together on our bench, speaking in low voices. "They don't believe us," Drew said bitterly. "They think we made it up. Or that we saw something else and got confused," Ryan added. But we all saw the same thing. It wasn't a mistake. I remained silent, staring at the path where the adults had disappeared. Part of me hoped they would find evidence to vindicate our story, while another part dreaded what might happen if they encountered the creature. Nearly an hour passed before they returned. The ranger led the way, his expression unreadable. Mr. Westfield followed, looking tired and slightly annoyed. As they approached, I searched their faces for any sign that they had discovered something unusual. "Well?" Mrs. Bennett asked as they reached us. The ranger shook his head. "Nothing out of the ordinary. We found the oak tree and searched the surrounding area thoroughly. There were some bird feathers on the ground, likely from a vulture or hawk based on the size and coloration, but that's not unusual. Predation happens regularly in the wild. No sign of your spider," Mr. Westfield added, directing his gaze at us. "Not even a web." "But it was there," Ryan insisted. "We all saw it." The ranger shrugged. "Without evidence, all I can record is an unconfirmed wildlife sighting. We do occasionally get reports of unusual animals in the park, though most turn out to be misidentifications or exaggerations." The implication was clear. He believed we had either invented the story or grossly misinterpreted what we had seen. The disappointment and frustration must have shown on our faces because the ranger adopted a more conciliatory tone. "Look, I'm not saying you didn't see something that frightened you, but from a scientific perspective, what you're describing simply doesn't exist in these mountains." Mr. Westfield checked his watch. "I think we should conclude our field trip for today. Everyone, gather your things. We'll be boarding the bus in 15 minutes. As the other students collected their backpacks and notebooks, I overheard snippets of conversation. Totally made it up to get attention. Probably. Saw a squirrel and freaked out. Ruined. The whole trip for everyone. The shame of being disbelieved, combined with the lingering fear, created a knot in my stomach. I knew what we had witnessed was real, but without evidence. Our account sounded like the product of overactive imaginations, or worse, a deliberate fabrication. The ride back to school passed in uncomfortable silence, at least for our group. The other students chatted and compared notes on the birds they had identified, occasionally glancing back at where Ryan, Drew, and I sat isolated at the rear of the bus. I stared out the window as the mountains receded in the distance, wondering about the creature we had left behind in those ancient woods. The following week at school was difficult. Word of our giant spider story spread quickly, making us the subjects of ridicule and practical jokes. Some students would mimic spider movements when we walked past, while others left crude drawings of spiders in our lockers and desks. Mr. Westfield seemed disappointed in us, treating our group with cool professionalism during science class. "Did you really see a monster in the woods?" A fourth-grade student asked me in the hallway one day. "My brother says you made it all up." I had stopped trying to convince anyone of the truth. "We saw something," I replied vaguely. "I don't know what it was." This non-committal response became my standard answer. Even my parents, initially concerned by my obvious distress after the field trip, eventually suggested that perhaps my imagination had run wild in an unfamiliar environment. "Forests can be scary places when you're not used to them," my father said one evening. "Shadows play tricks on your eyes. Sounds get distorted among the trees." I nodded as if agreeing, but internally I clung to the certainty of what I had witnessed. The memory remained vivid. The sudden movement, the vulture's strangled cry, those jointed legs wrapping around the struggling bird. No trick of light or shadow could explain that horror. Ryan, Drew, and I discussed it privately, comparing our recollections to ensure we hadn't imagined or exaggerated any details. Our accounts matched almost perfectly, reinforcing our conviction that the experience had been real. "I've been researching," Ryan told us, showing printouts from his computer. There are legends about giant spiders in different cultures around the world. Native American tribes in this region have stories about forest spirits that could take the form of enormous arthropods. But those are just myths, Drew argued. The ranger said the largest spiders here are just wolf spiders. What if there are species that haven't been discovered? I suggested. New insects are identified all the time in remote areas. Not spiders the size of dogs, Drew countered, though he looked uncertain. Something that big couldn't stay hidden for long. Unless there aren't many of them, Ryan said. Maybe they're extremely rare or they're good at avoiding humans. We speculated endlessly but reached no satisfying conclusions. The scientific impossibility of what we had seen conflicted with our direct experience, creating a cognitive dissonance that was difficult to resolve. About a month after the field trip, local news reported that a hiker had gone missing in Ridgeline Mountain State Park. Search parties combed the area for 3 days before finding the man's backpack and camera near a ravine. The hiker himself was never located. Authorities concluded he had likely fallen into the ravine and been carried away by the swift current of the seasonal stream below. When I heard this news, a cold dread settled in my stomach. The article didn't specify exactly where in the park the backpack had been found, but I couldn't help wondering if the missing hiker had encountered what we had seen in the tree. I became increasingly anxious about wooded areas, developing what my mother called an irrational fear of forests. I refused to go camping that summer, inventing excuses when friends invited me on outdoor excursions. At night, I sometimes woke from nightmares in which I was trapped in endless woods, pursued by a shadow with too many legs that moved unnaturally fast through the trees. My parents eventually arranged for me to speak with a counselor, who diagnosed me with a mild form of arachnophobia, triggered by a traumatic misperception during the field trip. The sessions helped with the acute anxiety, but they couldn't erase the fundamental certainty that what I had witnessed was no misperception. When 8th grade began the following fall, the incident had largely faded from the collective memory of our classmates. Newer gossip and scandals had replaced our story in the social hierarchy of middle school drama. Ryan, Drew, and I remained friends, but we spoke of the creature less frequently, as if by tacit agreement we had decided to move forward, rather than dwell on an experience no one else believed. One afternoon in October, as I was walking home from school, I noticed a large spider crawling across the sidewalk ahead of me. It was an ordinary house spider, no larger than a quarter, but I froze at the sight of it. As I watched, it dragged the body of a small moth toward the grass, prey several times larger than the predator itself. In that moment, I understood something that had been nagging at the edges of my consciousness since the field trip. Spiders, even small ones, are among the most efficient and terrifying predators on Earth. They act with mechanical precision, their movements guided by instinct rather than conscious thought. They feel no emotion, no remorse, no hesitation, only hunger and the drive to feed. What we had encountered in those mountains was this predatory efficiency scaled to nightmarish proportions. The creature hadn't pursued us because we weren't its prey. It had what it wanted, the vulture. But the knowledge that such a thing existed, hidden in the seemingly peaceful forest, had forever changed how I viewed the natural world. 10 years have passed since that spring day in the mountains. I'm now 23, a biology major specializing in entomology, the study of insects. My friends find this career choice ironic given my childhood experience, but to me, it makes perfect sense. I needed to understand what we had seen to place it within the context of known science or to prove to myself that it couldn't exist. Ryan became a journalist, his innate curiosity driving him to investigate unexplained phenomena and local mysteries. Drew took a more conventional path, studying business administration and working for a marketing firm. We remained in contact through college, though our once inseparable trio gradually drifted into the casual friendship of adults with different lives and priorities. Last month, I received an email from Ryan with an attachment and a brief message. Found this while researching a story on unexplained disappearances in national parks. Thought you should see it. The attachment was a scanned page from a local newspaper dated 1953, describing the disappearance of 2 park rangers in what was then called Ridgeline National Forest. The article mentioned that the men had been investigating reports of unusual wildlife sightings near an area known for its old-growth trees. Their equipment was found abandoned beside a massive oak, with no signs of struggle or injury. They were never located. I stared at the article for a long time, a familiar coldness spreading through my chest. Then I did something I had avoided for a decade. I searched for information about giant arachnids, specifically accounts of oversized specimens that defied scientific classification. Most results were predictably focused on known large species like the Goliath bird-eater tarantula, or articles debunking urban legends. But buried among these were occasional reports from remote regions of the world, a photograph of unusually large tracks in the Amazon, testimonies from indigenous tribes in Borneo about forest creatures they called night hunters, a Soviet expedition from the 1970s that documented unusually large silk structures in the Siberian wilderness. None provided conclusive evidence of anything approaching what we had seen. Yet the pattern of accounts from disconnected sources, spanning different continents and time periods, suggested something beyond mere folklore. I contacted a professor emeritus who had specialized in arthropod evolution, carefully framing my inquiry as academic curiosity rather than personal investigation. His response was dismissive but intriguing. The square cube law prevents terrestrial arthropods from reaching the sizes you describe in modern oxygen conditions. However, isolated evolutionary pockets can occasionally produce outliers that temporarily defy classification. Nature's adaptations sometimes outpace our understanding of biological limitations. 2 weeks ago, I returned to Ridgeline Mountain State Park for the first time since 7th grade. The parking lot had been expanded, and a new visitor center replaced the old ranger station. Educational displays detailed the park's ecosystem and wildlife, with no mention of anything unusual or unexplained. I hired a guide explaining that I wanted to document insect specimens for a research project. When I asked about the heritage oak, he readily agreed to take me there, commenting that it was a popular spot for nature photographers. As we approached the clearing, I felt my heart rate accelerate. The tree looked exactly as I remembered, massive, ancient, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like arthritic fingers. Yet in daylight, with an experienced guide beside me, the setting seemed benign, even beautiful. Interesting fact about old oaks like this, the guide said, pausing to admire the tree. Their canopies create entire ecosystems. Dozens of species can live in a single tree this size: birds, insects, small mammals. I nodded, scanning the branches overhead. Have there ever been reports of unusual wildlife in this area? Anything out of the ordinary? The guide gave me a curious look. Like what? I don't know, I replied, trying to sound casual. Unexpected predators, strange sightings, that sort of thing. He shrugged. Bears and mountain lions occasionally, though they generally avoid humans. Why do you ask? I didn't answer directly. Instead, I pointed to a dark hollow high in the oak's trunk. What about up there? Ever seen anything nesting in those cavities? Owls sometimes, raccoons. Nature abhors a vacuum. Any good shelter gets used by something. We spent an hour collecting insect specimens near the base of the tree. Nothing unusual appeared in my samples. Just typical forest arthropods, none larger than my thumbnail. As we prepared to leave, I found myself staring up at the canopy one last time. The branches swayed gently in the breeze, sunlight filtering through the leaves to create shifting patterns on the forest floor. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed movement that didn't match the wind's rhythm, something deliberate rather than passive. A dark shape adjusting its position, perhaps, or merely a shadow from a cloud passing overhead. Ready to head back? The guide asked, packing away his equipment. I hesitated, still watching the upper branches. Do you believe there could be species in these mountains that haven't been officially documented? Things that stay hidden from human observation? He considered the question seriously. In microfauna, definitely. New insect species are discovered all the time. As for larger animals, and he shrugged. Less likely, but not impossible. These forests have existed for thousands of years. They keep their secrets well. As we walked back along the trail, I maintained a conscious effort not to look over my shoulder. The weight of unseen eyes seemed to follow our departure, a sensation I recognized from childhood, but had attributed to trauma and imagination. Now, as an adult with scientific training, I find myself caught between rational skepticism and the undeniable reality of what we witnessed that day. The creature defied biological constraints as we understand them, yet 3 separate observers confirmed its existence. Either we experienced a mass hallucination, statistically improbable, or there are aspects of our natural world that remain beyond the boundaries of documented science. I've scheduled another visit to the park next month, this time equipped with motion-activated cameras and more sophisticated collection tools. Ryan has agreed to accompany me, his journalistic instincts aroused by the historical patterns of disappearances in the area. Perhaps we'll find nothing. Perhaps the creature was an anomaly, a solitary aberration that has long since died. Or perhaps it waits still, hidden among ancient branches, watching with patient, predatory awareness as hikers and students pass unknowingly beneath its perch. In either case, I no longer walk comfortably beneath trees without glancing upward, searching for unusual shadows or movements that don't match the wind. Some knowledge once gained cannot be unlearned. Some fears once experienced become permanent companions. The forest may appear peaceful, but I know better. In its darkest corners, in the spaces between documented species and understood biology, there exist things that defy classification, predators that move with terrible efficiency and remain, for most of humanity, mercifully unseen. But I have seen, and I cannot forget.